The wealthiest man in the valley, $1 million ranch, thousands of cattle, power no one dared challenge. And yet one morning, a stranger walked straight into his house, cooked dinner in his kitchen, and refused to leave even when he asked. She didn't ask for a job. She didn't ask permission. She just stayed. And that would change everything. The ranch, the valley, and the heart of the man who thought money could solve everything. Like and comment the city you're viewing from so I know how far this story has come. And don't go anywhere, because this story has only just begun. The letter had been a mistake. Cole Mercer knew it the morning after he sent it, when he woke up with a dry mouth, and the particular kind of regret that comes from making decisions late at night with a glass of whiskey in hand and nobody around to talk sense into you. He'd written the thing himself, which was unusual. Cole had people for correspondence, had a foreman who handled hiring, had systems built over 2 decades of running the largest cattle operation in the Sulphur Creek Valley. But it was past midnight and the house felt like a cave, and somewhere between his third drink and the sound of wind pushing against the shutters, he'd pulled out paper and written a letter to the Ashford Employment Agency in Tucson requesting a capable partner to help manage the Mercer Ranch estate. Partner. That's the word he'd used. He cringed at it now. He sent a second letter the next morning asking them to disregard the first. He received no reply confirming receipt of either. 6 weeks passed. He forgot about it, or told himself he had. Then one Tuesday in late September, a woman arrived at his front gate in a hired wagon with 2 leather bags and a cardboard box tied with twine, and his gatekeeper, a slow-moving man named Bert, who'd worked the property for 11 years, sent word up to the main house that someone was asking for Mr. Mercer by name. Cole was in the middle of reviewing water usage reports with his foreman, Dan Purcell, a thick-shouldered man with a gray mustache who had opinions about everything and kept most of them to himself. Cole handed the reports back to Dan without finishing them and walked down to the gate himself, because something in the phrasing of Bert's message, "She says she has an arrangement," struck him as the kind of thing that needed to be handled directly. She was standing beside the wagon when he got there, not sitting on the bench like someone waiting to be received. Standing. Her bags were already on the ground. The cardboard box was balanced on the gatepost. She was somewhere in her mid-30s, average height, wearing a gray traveling dress that had seen a long journey and a pair of boots that were sensible rather than pretty. Her hair was dark and pulled back without fuss. She wasn't what he'd call beautiful in any conventional way. Her jaw was too strong for that, her expression too composed. She looked like someone who had decided something before she arrived and wasn't especially interested in renegotiating. "Mr. Mercer," she said. Not a question. "That's right." He looked at the bags on the ground. "You planning on staying somewhere?" "The Ashford agency sent me. My name is Clara Ashford." She paused, then added, as though clarifying something small, "It's my family's agency. I handle placements personally when the position is unusual." Cole stared at her. "I sent a letter canceling that request." "You sent a letter 6 weeks after the first one." She reached into a small leather case she was carrying over one arm and produced 2 envelopes. She held them both out toward him. "We received both. Agency policy, when a cancellation arrives after placement has begun, is to allow the candidate to present themselves and let the client make the final determination in person." She paused. "It's in the contract your foreman signed 2 years ago when you used us to place your current kitchen staff." Cole did not take the envelopes. He looked at Bert, who was carefully studying the dirt near his boots. Then he looked back at Clara Ashford. "I don't need an estate manager. Your letter suggested otherwise." "My letter was written at midnight, and I wasn't thinking clearly." "Most honest requests aren't," she said. Her tone wasn't unkind. It wasn't particularly warm either. It was the tone of someone who had heard every version of this conversation before and had stopped finding it interesting. "Mr. Mercer, I've traveled 2 days to get here. I'm not asking you to sign anything today. I'm asking you to let me eat a meal and look at your property before you tell me to leave." Cole looked at the gate, looked at her bags, looked at the box on the post with the twine tied in a neat bow. "You can eat in the cookhouse," he said. "I'll have someone show you." "I'd prefer to use your kitchen," she said. "I'd like to see what you're working with." He had no idea why he didn't just tell her no again. Later, he would wonder about that. He stepped back and gestured at the gate, and she picked up one of her bags. Left the other for Bert without asking, just assumed he'd carry it, which he did. and walked up the road toward the main house like she'd made this walk before. Oh, the Mercer Ranch main house was not a house in any modest sense of the word. It was a two-story structure built from Sonoran sandstone with a wraparound porch on three sides, and enough rooms that Cole had stopped going into the east wing after his wife Margaret died 3 years ago. The kitchen alone was larger than most family homes in Sulphur Creek. 8 burners, a walk-in cold storage room, a long oak work table scarred from years of use. It was a kitchen designed for feeding a working household, for the kind of domestic operation that a ranch like the Mercer required. Right now it was staffed by 2 women who came in from town each morning and left before supper, because Cole rarely ate supper at home anymore, and the evening meal had gradually become an afterthought. Clara walked through it without commenting for almost 2 minutes, which was longer than it sounds. She opened the cold storage room. She checked the burner valves. She looked at the larder shelves and the state of the copper pots, and ran her thumb along the inside edge of the flour bin and looked at what came off on her skin. "Your flour's been sitting," she said. "I use what I need." "You're not using much." She set her bag down on the oak table. "What do you eat for supper?" Cole crossed his arms. "I eat in town most nights, or I have something cold." "Every night?" "Most nights." She nodded once, like this confirmed something she'd already suspected. Then she started opening cabinets. "There's no need for you to... Do you have onions?" He stopped. "What?" "Onions. And I saw cured ham in the cold room. I need to know if there's flour that hasn't gone off and whether you have any decent fat for a skillet." Cole stood in the doorway of his own kitchen and watched a woman he'd met 12 minutes ago begin pulling items out of his larder with the efficiency of someone who had already decided what she was making. Something about the situation was so far outside his normal experience that his usual instincts, which were swift and certain and had built a cattle empire, failed to engage. He just stood there. "You're not leaving," he said. "I told you I wasn't." She found the onions. "Sit down, Mr. Mercer. This will take about 40 minutes. He sat down. He didn't know why. Well, she made a ham and onion hash with cornbread cooked in a cast-iron pan, and she made it without fuss, without commentary, without once looking at him for approval or permission. The kitchen filled up with the smell of rendered fat and caramelized onion, and something that Cole had not smelled in that particular combination since before Margaret got sick. Since before the slow years of illness and the longer years of absence that followed, the years where the house had become a place he walked through rather than lived in. He ate at the kitchen table, which he hadn't done in months. Usually he took whatever food there was to his study or didn't bother sitting down at all. Clara sat across from him with her own plate and ate with the same no-nonsense efficiency she applied to everything else. When he was halfway through, she said, "Tell me about the water situation on the east pasture." He looked up. "How do you know about the east pasture?" "Your letter mentioned supply management concerns. East pasture water access is usually the first thing to go on a large operation when management attention drops off." She forked up some hash. "Am I wrong?" He was quiet for a moment. "The irrigation line's been partially blocked since spring. We've been routing around it." "What's it costing you in cattle weight?" "My foreman's estimate is about 8% below expectation for the east herd." "And you haven't fixed the line because Dan says it'll take 3 weeks to dig out and reroute, and I haven't had the patience to deal with the disruption." She nodded, looking at her plate. "So you're trading a 3-week inconvenience for a permanent loss. That's the kind of decision that makes sense when you're not paying attention to your numbers." Cole set his fork down. He wasn't angry, not exactly. He was something closer to unsettled. "You don't know what you're talking about. I know what 8% below weight expectation across an east herd on a ranch this size costs per season," she said. "I've managed 4 estate operations in the last 7 years. You're bleeding money in quiet ways, Mr. Mercer, and the bleeding's been going on long enough that nobody around you sees it anymore because they've adjusted to it." The kitchen was quiet except for the tick of the iron cooling. "I told you to leave," Cole said. "You told me to eat in the cookhouse," she corrected him. "I made an alternative suggestion, and you accepted it." "I didn't accept anything." "You sat down." She looked at him directly, not challenging, just stating something they both knew was true. "You sat down and you ate supper in your own kitchen. When did you last do that?" He didn't answer. She let the silence sit there without trying to fill it, which was unusual in his experience. Most people got nervous around his silences and talked to cover them. Claire Ashford just ate her cornbread and waited. 3 months, he finally said. I'll give you 3 months to show me what you think you can fix. He picked up his fork again. After that, if I'm not satisfied, you go back to Tucson and we never mention this again. She considered it. I'll need full access to your books, your supply records, and your staff roster. You'll get access to what's relevant. Everything is relevant. He looked at her. You want access to my complete financial records. I want to understand the whole operation. That's what you hired me to do. I didn't hire you. You will, she said. Not smug, not smiling, just certain. Because you know I'm right about the East pasture, and you know I'm right about the flower bin, and you're sitting in your kitchen for the first time in months because something about this evening felt different. She stood up and began clearing the plates. 3 months. I'll have recommendations for the irrigation line by the end of the week. Cole sat at his kitchen table and listened to the sound of someone washing dishes in his house, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, something he didn't have a word for yet and wasn't ready to examine. Dan Purcell was not happy. Cole found him the next morning in the barn, going over the condition of the tack with the thoroughness of a man who had opinions he was about to express whether or not he was asked. She slept here, Dan said. It wasn't a question. I gave her the guest room in the south wing. You gave a stranger from Tucson a room in the main house. She's not from Tucson originally. The agency is in Tucson. Cole. Dan set down the bridle he was holding. Dan only used his first name when things had reached a level of seriousness that he felt required the formality of abandoning formality. You know what the men are going to say. The men can say whatever they want. And what about the Hendersons, the Caldwells? They hear there's a woman living in your house. She's an estate manager. It's a professional arrangement. At midnight on a Tuesday, was it? Cole turned to face him. Dan was the best foreman he'd ever had. He was also, at times, exhausting. She arrived in the afternoon. I hired her on a trial basis. You didn't ask me. I don't ask you who to hire. You ask me about everything that affects this operation. This is the operation, Dan. She's going to review our supply management and our bookkeeping, and she's going to fix the irrigation problem on the east pasture. Dan's expression shifted. We've been working around that line for 6 months. I know. She's been here one night, and she already found the east pasture problem. She asked the right questions. Dan was quiet. He picked up the bridle again and turned it over in his hands, looking at it. What do you know about her? I know she managed 4 operations in 7 years. I know she's capable. I know she's not impressed by money, which is either a problem or a recommendation depending on how you look at it. And you don't know which. Not yet. Cole started toward the door. Give her access to the supply ledgers. I want to see her first report by Friday. Cole. Dan's voice stopped him at the barn door. Just be careful, all right? Cole looked back. She's an estate manager, Dan. Dan held his gaze. Yeah, he said. That's what I said. Clara's first week was quiet in the way that a river is quiet, moving fast under a calm surface. She was up before the ranch hands every morning, and she had a habit of walking the property before breakfast that unsettled people who weren't used to being observed. Not because she was unfriendly, she nodded to the men she passed, remembered their names after one introduction, asked specific questions about specific things, but because she was paying attention in a way that felt thorough. She walked the fence lines. She inspected the grain storage. She sat in the supply shed for an hour one afternoon counting bags and checking them against the ledger entries. On Thursday afternoon, she came to find Cole in his study. Your head of supply is shorting the bags, she said. Cole looked up from the letter he was writing. Excuse me? Frank Osley. He's been recording full-weight deliveries and taking the difference. Been going on for at least 2 seasons based on the ledger inconsistencies. She set a piece of paper on his desk, columns of numbers, neat and annotated. I can't tell you exactly how much yet. I'll have a full accounting by end of next week. But it's not small. Cole looked at the numbers. He looked at them for a long time. Frank Osley had been with the Mercer Ranch for 9 years. He'd worked under Cole's father before he'd worked under Cole. He had a wife and 3 kids in Sulphur Creek, and he showed up every morning without fail and had never given anyone a reason to look twice at him. You're certain, Cole said. I cross-referenced 3 years of delivery manifests against the storage counts and the usage logs, Clara said. There's a consistent 10 to 12% discrepancy that moves with Frank's schedule and disappears during the 2 weeks he took off last spring. Cole sat back. The letter he'd been writing, to a cattle buyer in Phoenix, seemed very far away. If you're right, this is a serious accusation. If I'm right, you've lost somewhere between $4,000 and $6,000 over 2 seasons. She stood with her hands quiet at her sides, not fidgeting, not softening it. I know that's not easy to hear about someone who's been with you that long, but you asked me to review the operation. I didn't ask you to. He stopped. He hadn't specifically asked her to review supply management. She'd just done it. I'll look at the numbers myself. Of course. She didn't say anything else about it. Cole spent that evening going through Frank Osley's supply records with a lamp and a pad of paper, and by 10 o'clock he had confirmed everything she'd found and found 2 additional inconsistencies she hadn't flagged yet. He didn't sleep much that night. He handled Frank Osley himself, privately, on a Friday morning before the rest of the hands arrived. He presented what he'd found. Frank didn't deny it for long, just long enough to realize that the evidence was comprehensive, and then he sat down on an overturned crate in the supply barn and put his face in his hands. Cole gave him until Monday to pack his things and leave quietly. He also told him, in terms that were careful and final, that if he heard the situation discussed publicly, there would be legal consequences. Frank nodded. He looked like a man who had known something was coming for a long time and was almost relieved to have it arrive. When Cole came back to the main house, Clara was at the kitchen table with the water rights documentation spread across the surface, a different project entirely, something she'd apparently picked up between breakfast and noon. It's handled, Cole said. She looked up. I'm sorry you had to do that. He wasn't sure what he expected. Satisfaction, maybe? The look of someone who'd been proved right. She didn't look satisfied. She just looked like someone who understood that being right about something doesn't always feel like winning. How did you know? He said. The specific thing to look for. It's the same pattern in every operation that's been running on momentum instead of attention, she said. When ownership is distracted, the people with access to small systems start taking small advantages. Most of them start small and can't stop themselves from going further. She looked at the documents in front of her. It's not about bad people, usually. It's about what happens when nobody's watching. Cole sat down across from her. You've seen this before. More than once, she paused. The man before Frank, at an operation I managed in New Mexico. He'd been doing something similar for 4 years. The family was devastated when we found it. Felt like a betrayal. It is a betrayal. Yes, she said. It is. But it's also a management failure. Somebody should have been watching sooner. Cole said nothing for a moment. Outside, he could hear the hands arriving for the morning shift, boots on gravel, someone calling out about a fence post in the North Quarter. The ordinary sounds of his ranch operating around the fact that one of his people had been stealing from him for 2 years. The irrigation line on the east pasture, he said. What's your plan? Clara pulled a different document out from under the water rights papers. She'd already drawn a diagram. Bamasin. The east pasture irrigation problem turned out to be more complicated than anyone had initially assessed, which was, as Clara pointed out without any visible pleasure in being right, exactly why it had been put off for 6 months. It wasn't a single blocked line. It was a section of aging pipe that had been patched 3 times, built up a sediment blockage, and finally cracked under pressure at 2 separate joints. Fixing the crack in only one place, which is what the previous assessment had recommended, would have solved the immediate problem for roughly 1 season before the second joint failed. Clara identified both cracks on the second day of excavation and redesigned the repair to address both while they had the line open. Dan Purcell, who had supervised the excavation with the expression of a man attending his own funeral, studied her revised repair diagram for a long time before he said anything. This'll hold another 20 years, he said finally. At least, she said. The original fix would have held maybe 18 months. I know. Dan looked at her. That would have been easier for you. Come in. Do the quick fix, report a success. That would have been dishonest, Clara said, and went back to the trench to confirm a measurement. Dan watched her go. Later that evening, he came to find Cole in the study. She knows what she's doing, he said. No preamble. Cole didn't look up from what he was reading. I know. I didn't think she would. I wasn't sure either. Dan stood in the doorway. You going to keep her on after 3 months? Cole finally looked up. Ask me in 3 months. Dan left. Cole sat with the question longer than he should have, and when he put it down, he wasn't sure he'd put it all the way down. The trouble with Sulphur Creek started in the second week. It didn't come from the ranch. It came from town, which was where most of the trouble in Cole's experience had always originated. Sulphur Creek was not a large place, but it had layers to it. The merchant class that ran the main street businesses, the social set that organized themselves around the Caldwell family's standing and the Henderson family's money, and a general culture of knowing everyone else's affairs and having views about them. Cole had navigated these layers for 20 years by being the most powerful man in the valley, which meant that people were careful with their opinions in front of him, even when they were less careful elsewhere. Clara had no such protection. He heard about it first from Rita Voss, who ran the dry goods store, and who had always been more direct with him than most. She caught him on the street on a Wednesday when he'd come in for supply orders and said, with the air of someone delivering necessary unpleasantness, "You should know people are talking about that woman you've got out at the ranch." Cole looked at her. Talking what? Saying she's after your money, Cole. Saying no woman takes a job like that for the work. Rita was not unkind. She was practical, and practical people in Sulphur Creek served up gossip the way they served up medicine, as something you needed even if it tasted bad. Eleanor Caldwell said at church that a woman who travels alone and moves into a man's house is either desperate or scheming, and she can't decide which. Clara Ashford is managing my estate. Well, I know that. I'm not sure Eleanor's definition of estate management includes what she's imagining. Cole bought his supplies and drove back to the ranch with something cold and tight sitting in his chest. He told Clara about it that evening. She was at the kitchen table again. She seemed to do most of her work at the kitchen table, which struck him as deliberate somehow, like she'd made a decision about where she belonged in the house, and the kitchen was it. She was going through the household accounts line by line. He told her what Rita had said. Not all of it, not Eleanor Caldwell's specific phrasing, but the substance of it. Clara didn't look up from the accounts. What did you tell her? I told her you were managing my estate. Good. She turned a page. That's all you have to say? She looked up then. What would you like me to say, Mr. Mercer? I don't know. You don't seem particularly bothered. I've been called worse things, she said. In New Mexico, the woman who ran the household staff told everyone I was sleeping with the owner. In her case, I suspected it was because I'd identified that she was stealing linens, and she wanted to redirect attention. Clara went back to the accounts. The accusations usually tell you more about the people making them than about the person they're aimed at. It'll affect your reputation here. My reputation in Sulphur Creek isn't my primary concern. She paused. My work is. Cole leaned against the doorframe. It might affect your ability to work here. If people believe, then they'll believe it. She set down her pencil and looked at him squarely. Mr. Mercer, I'm going to do my job. I'm going to do it well. I cannot control what Eleanor Caldwell says at church, and spending energy trying to would take away from the work, which is the only thing that actually matters. She picked up the pencil again. If it becomes a problem for you, if my presence here creates difficulties that outweigh my usefulness, then you can end our arrangement. That's always been an option, but I'm not going to change my conduct or reduce my work to manage what strangers think of me. Tetpus orapima. Cole stood there for another moment. You don't make anything easy, he said. She glanced up. Neither do you. He almost smiled. He covered it by looking at the window. By the end of the second month, the numbers told a story that Dan Purcell, who had started asking for Clara's morning reports before Cole asked for them, laid out on the table in the foreman's office one morning in late October. The East Pasture cattle weights were up. The supply waste had dropped 40% in 6 weeks, partly from Frank Osley's departure and partly from the inventory system Clara had put in place that required 2-person sign-off on every delivery. The bookkeeping irregularities she'd identified, smaller than Frank's theft but significant over time, had been addressed, and the accounts were balanced for the first time in 3 years. The irrigation repair had already paid for itself in projected cattle health improvements. She found us about $9,000, Dan said, between recovered losses and projected efficiency gains. Cole looked at the numbers. In 2 months. In 2 months. Cole sat with that. $9,000 wasn't the kind of money that changed the Mercer Ranch. They were operating at a scale where $9,000 was significant but not transformational. What it meant was something different. It meant that the ranch he thought he understood had been operating below what it could be, slowly and invisibly, for long enough that the gap had become normal. It meant that he'd stopped seeing the cracks. "She's good," Cole said. It cost him something to say it out loud, which he recognized as a defect in himself. "She's better than good," Dan said. "She's the best operational mind I've seen on a ranch this size, and she doesn't care whether you know it." That last part sat with Cole for the rest of the day. He found her that evening on the back porch, which looked out over the west pasture toward where the sun was going down in the particular orange and purple combination that Arizona produced in October like it was showing off. She was sitting with a cup of coffee and the water rights document she'd been working through for the past week. She didn't look up when he came out, but she didn't look surprised either. He sat down in the other chair. For a while, neither of them said anything. The light changed. "Why did you come here?" he said. Not accusatory, just asking. She took a minute to answer. "The letter." "I canceled the letter." "You canceled it after you sent it. The fact that you sent it at all." She turned the coffee cup in her hands. "The agency gets a lot of requests. Most of them are standard. Someone needs a cook, needs a housekeeper, needs someone to manage accounts. Your letter was different." "How?" "You wrote it yourself, and you wrote partner." She glanced at him. "That's not a word ranchers use when they're hiring staff. That's a word someone uses when they're trying to describe something they don't quite have words for." Cole looked at the pasture. "I didn't mean it the way it probably sounds now." "I know that." She went back to her document. "But it told me the position was unusual, and unusual positions are the ones I take personally. Most people wouldn't travel 2 days for unusual." "Most people," she said, "aren't me." The sun finished setting. The pasture went from gold to gray. Somewhere down by the barn, a horse stamped and settled. "3 months isn't up yet," Cole said. "No," she agreed, "but I'm not going to ask you to leave in a month." She didn't react to that. She turned another page of the water rights document. "I need you to know something," Cole said, "about why the house is the way it is. About why I—" He stopped. This kind of conversation didn't come naturally to him. He was a man who had built a cattle empire partly by saying exactly what needed to be said and nothing more. "My wife, Margaret, she died 3 years ago. It was a long illness. 1.5 years of it happening slowly." He looked at his hands. "After, I kept the operation running because that's what I know how to do. The house—" He stopped again. Clara let the silence sit. "The house stopped feeling like something I needed to take care of," he said finally. "It just felt like the building I slept in." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know. I figured you could tell." "It's not a criticism," she said. "Grief does that. It makes the immediate things, the animals, the work, the numbers, feel manageable, and the rest of it feels too large." She closed the water rights document. "But it compounds. The things you stop tending to don't stay still. They deteriorate. Like the east pasture. Like everything." She picked up her coffee. "I'm not here to fix your grief, Mr. Mercer. I'm here to fix your ranch. But sometimes those things are more connected than people want to admit." Cole sat in the cooling air and let that land where it was going to land. "Cole," he said. She looked at him. "My name. It's Cole." He paused. "We've been at this long enough." She considered it. "Clara," she said. They sat on the back porch as the stars came out over the west pasture. Two people who had walked around each other for 2 months learning the edges of what the other one was. Not yet touching any of it, but no longer pretending it wasn't there. Inside the house, the kitchen was clean. The accounts were balanced. The east pasture cattle were gaining weight. The supply shed was running honest for the first time in 2 years. Something was being rebuilt, board by board, in a house that had been going quiet for 3 years. Neither of them talked about it, but they both knew it was happening. The 3rd month arrived without announcement, the way significant things often do. Between one morning and the next, between a cup of coffee going cold on the kitchen table and the sound of the first hands arriving for the day shift, Clara had stopped counting the days sometime in the middle of October, which surprised her when she noticed it. She was not someone who lost track of timelines, but somewhere between the irrigation repair and the supply ledger overhaul and the long evenings on the back porch with the water rights documents, she had stopped thinking about the arrangement in terms of when it might end. That was either a good sign or a problem. She hadn't decided which. The ranch itself was telling a clear story. The numbers didn't lie, says they never did, which was the one thing Clara had always found reassuring about numbers in a life where most other things required interpretation. The East pasture cattle were up 11% on projected weight gain. Supply waste had dropped to under 6%, which wasn't perfect, but was a legitimate improvement from the 22% she'd found on arrival. The household accounts were balanced and clean for the first time in what the record suggested was closer to 4 years than 3, though she'd decided not to say that to Cole because some truths were better absorbed in pieces. What the numbers couldn't tell her was what was happening in Sulphur Creek. She knew something was shifting in town before anyone said anything directly. She felt it in small accumulations, the way the merchant Hale at the feed store began processing her supply orders just slowly enough to be noticeable. The way 2 women she'd nodded to on the main street the previous month now looked past her without acknowledgement. The way the conversation at the counter of Rita's dry goods store paused when she walked in and resumed in a different key when she left. Clara had been through versions of this before. In New Mexico, and before that in Colorado, managing operations on properties where her presence as an unmarried woman doing serious work made people uncomfortable in ways they couldn't quite name and so named as something else. Ambition, impropriety, scheming. The words changed. The shape of the thing didn't. She mentioned none of this to Cole. He had enough to manage. What she did mention, on a Tuesday morning in the first week of November when they were both in the study reviewing the month's figures, was the water rights problem. There's an irregularity in the northeastern boundary documentation, she said. She'd put the relevant papers on his desk, the original territorial survey, the subsequent deed registration, and the water agreement filed with the county in 1887. This section here. She pointed to a line in the agreement. The language gives you right of first use on Sulphur Creek's upstream flow as far north as the Granger boundary, but the current filing with the county office doesn't include this clause. Somewhere between the original agreement and the most recent registration, it got dropped. Cole leaned forward and looked at where she was pointing. How recent is the registration? 1891, 4 years ago. She let him look at the documents. It may have been a clerical error. It may have been deliberate. Either way, if the upstream water rights aren't correctly documented, your legal standing on East pasture water access is weaker than it should be. Who would benefit from that weakness? Clara straightened up. Anyone whose land touches yours on the north side. Cole was quiet for a moment. Granger. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Silas Granger's name had come up twice in the first month. Once from Dan, who mentioned it in passing when discussing the valley's power structure, and once from Cole himself, briefly, and with the particular restraint that indicated something he preferred not to discuss at length. She'd done her own research through public records and what was available at the county clerk's office. Silas Granger owned 2 ranches outright and had controlling interest in a third. He was methodical, he was patient, and in the last 5 years he had acquired 4 properties in the valley through a combination of legal pressure, debt leverage, and what the public record described only as negotiated sale, a phrase that in Clara's experience covered a wide range of things, most of them unpleasant. I'll get the original agreement filed correctly, Clara said. I need to go to the county clerk's office and speak to someone about the corrected registration. I'll come with you. You don't need to. Clara. He said her name with the particular firmness that meant the decision was already made. I'll come with you. She didn't argue. There were times when his presence was a practical asset rather than a complication, and the county clerk's office was one of them. They drove into Sulphur Creek on a Thursday, and what happened in the county clerk's office was not what either of them expected. The clerk, a man named Hewitt, thin and deferential and visibly uncomfortable with conflict of any kind, looked at the original 1887 agreement and the current registration, and agreed after some careful navigation that Yes, the clause appeared to have been omitted from the current filing. He also said, with increasing discomfort, that the current filing had been specifically requested by a third party as a routine re-registration, and that the party who had initiated it was listed in the county records as the Granger Land Company. Cole sat very still in the wooden chair across from Hewitt's desk for about 5 seconds. "When?" he said. "March of this year," Hewitt said. He had the expression of a man who wished he'd called in sick. "That's 8 months ago," Cole said. "Yes, sir. And you allowed a third party to re-register my water rights documentation. The paperwork was properly filed, Mr. Mercer, and at the time there was no objection on record because nobody knew it was happening." Cole's voice was controlled. It was the kind of controlled that was more alarming than anger. Clara put her hand flat on the desk, not on Cole's arm, on the desk. The gesture pulled Hewitt's attention to her. "Mr. Hewitt, we're going to file the corrected registration today, with the complete original clause reinstated. What do you need from us to do that?" Hewitt looked at her, then at Cole, then back at her. "I'll need the original document and a notarized statement of ownership establishing the chain of title since the original filing." "We have the original document." She set it on his desk. "The chain of title is in the deed records on file in this office. We can pull it together today if you're able to notarize." Hewitt looked at the document. He looked at Cole. He made a decision that Clara suspected was less about legal duty and more about which outcome he found less frightening. "I can do that today," he said. They were in the clerk's office for 2 hours. When they left, the corrected registration was filed and stamped, and a copy was folded into Clara's leather case. Cole didn't say much on the drive back. She let him have the quiet. When they were about a mile from the ranch gate, he said, "He knew." "The registration or the water rights?" "Both. Granger knew about the original clause and had it removed, and he knew I wasn't paying enough attention to catch it." He said this last part without bitterness, which was somehow worse than if he'd been bitter. It was the flat tone of someone looking at something clearly for the first time. "He's been watching the operation. He's been watching it for a while, I think," Clara said. "The timing of the re-registration in March, that's 6 months after Margaret died. If someone was looking for a moment when your attention would be elsewhere." The road went quiet under the wagon wheels. Cole's hands were steady on the reins, but his jaw was set. "How much else is there?" he said. "How much else has been moved while I wasn't watching?" "I don't know yet," she said. "I'm going to find out." She spent the next 3 weeks going through every county filing associated with the Mercer Ranch going back 10 years. Cole gave her access to everything. Not grudgingly, not with conditions, just handed her the key to the filing cabinet in his study and said whatever you need in a tone that meant he'd crossed some internal threshold and was done managing what she could and couldn't see. What she found was not catastrophic, but it was deliberate. 3 smaller irregularities in boundary documentation. A grazing rights agreement that had been allowed to lapse without renewal, which had weakened their legal claim to summer pasture on the northern slope. And a debt instrument, small, almost negligible in the context of the Mercer Ranch's overall finances, that had been sold by the original creditor to a holding company that Clara traced, after 2 days of careful cross-referencing, to the Granger Land Company. She told Cole everything over the course of an evening, laying documents out on the kitchen table in the order that made the pattern clearest. He listened without interrupting, which was how she'd learned he processed serious information. He went still and quiet, like a man taking inventory of damage after a storm. When she finished, he said, "He bought my debt." "A small piece of it, but yes." "Why?" "It's insignificant. He can't leverage that amount against an operation this size." "Not on its own," Claire said, "but debt instruments can be combined. If he acquires enough small claims from multiple creditors over time, he can consolidate them and apply pressure in a way that no single small debt would allow." She paused. "It's also a signal." He wanted a foothold, something on paper that establishes a legal relationship, however minor, between the Granger Company and the Mercer Ranch. Cole looked at the documents for a long time. "He's patient?" "Very. He's been building this for at least 2 years. Probably longer." She straightened one of the papers unnecessarily, just to have something to do with her hands. "The question is what he wants. Acquisition of the water rights would give him control of upstream flow to 3 of his own properties. But the Mercer Ranch as a whole, Would make him the largest landowner in the territory, Cole said flatly, by a wide margin. The kitchen was quiet. Through the window, the night was clear and cold, the way Arizona nights got in November when the days were still warm and the temperature dropped fast after sundown. Clara heard the distant sound of a coyote, far off, and then nothing. I want to be honest with you about something, she said. He looked at her. The agency received a communication last week from a company I didn't recognize initially. It took me a day to trace it. They contacted the Ashford agency and indicated that my placement here was irregular, that the original cancellation of the request should have been honored, and that they intended to file a formal complaint with the Arizona Placement Authority. She kept her voice even. The company is a subsidiary of the Granger Land Company. Something moved through Cole's expression. Not surprise, exactly. More like the look of a man who has been expecting a particular blow and feels the specific grim satisfaction of being proved right about where it was coming from. He's trying to have you removed. He's trying to eliminate the person who found the irregularities, Clara said, and he's doing it through legal channels, which is how he does everything. If the complaint goes through, the agency could be required to recall me pending review. That process takes months. He wants you gone before you find anything else. I expect so. Cole stood up. He walked to the window and stood there with his hands in his pockets, looking at the dark beyond the glass. Clara watched him from the table. What do we do? He said. She noticed he said we. She had noticed, over the weeks, the gradual shift in his pronouns, from I and my to we in the operation. She hadn't said anything about it. About the agency complaint, there are legitimate responses, she said. The original cancellation was filed after placement had begun, which, under the agency's own contract terms, gives the candidate the right to present themselves in person, which I did. The complaint has no legal merit under the existing agreement. I've already written a formal response. She paused. But the complaint isn't really the point. Even if we defeat it, he'll find another mechanism. So we need to deal with Granger directly. Eventually, she said, but not yet. Right now, we don't have enough. Cole turned back from the window. Enough what? Documentation, legal standing, evidence of coordinated interference as opposed to individual irregularities that could each be explained separately. She folded her hands on the table. He's careful. Everything he's done has a clean explanation on its own. The water rights re-registration was properly filed. The lapsed grazing agreement was an administrative error on the ranch's end. The debt instrument was a routine commercial sale. Each piece is deniable. She looked at him steadily. We need to show the pattern. That takes time and it takes careful documentation. If we move against him before we have that, he has better lawyers, more political connections, and deeper pockets than anyone who'd back us. Cole sat back down. So we wait. We prepare, she said. There's a difference. The social pressure from town reached a different level entirely in November, and this time Clara couldn't ignore it as cleanly as she'd managed before. It started with Eleanor Caldwell, who was the wife of the largest merchant in Sulphur Creek, and who had, as far as Clara could tell, appointed herself the guardian of the valley's social standards. Eleanor was not a vicious woman. Clara had made that assessment after 2 encounters, but she was conventional in the particular way that made convention feel like virtue, and Clara's presence at the Mercer Ranch violated conventions that Eleanor found genuinely unsettling. Eleanor came to call on a Wednesday afternoon, which was a calculated choice. Cole was in the North Pasture, which everyone in town knew was his regular Wednesday pattern. She arrived with another woman named Frances Blythe, who ran the schoolhouse, and who seemed to be present primarily as moral support or witness. Clara met them at the front door because there was nobody else to, and she showed them into the sitting room because that was what the situation called for. Eleanor Caldwell was a handsome woman in her 50s with silver hair and an expression that suggested she'd spent decades being right about things. She took in the sitting room, which Clara had reorganized, dusted, and returned to functional use sometime in October, with a look that managed to be both approving and complicated. The house looks better than it has in years, Eleanor said. Thank you, Clara said. Margaret would have appreciated that. A small pause. You know about Margaret? I know Mr. Mercer lost his wife 3 years ago. Yes. Eleanor folded her hands in her lap. We all cared deeply about Margaret. She was a significant part of this community. Another pause, more pointed. Cole has been, well, he's been managing. He has, Clara agreed. She waited. Eleanor looked at Francis, who was studying a small painting on the wall with excessive interest. Then Eleanor looked back at Clara. I'll be direct, Miss Ashford, because I think you're a direct person, and I prefer not to waste either of our time. I appreciate that. People are concerned. Eleanor said it plainly, without the softening she might have applied to a different audience. Your situation here is unconventional. People are talking, not because they wish Cole harm, but because they care about his reputation and, she paused, about his being taken advantage of during a vulnerable period. Clara looked at her. By me. By someone who came here without a proper introduction, without references anyone in the valley can verify, and who is living in a widower's home. Eleanor held her gaze. I'm not saying that's what you're doing. I'm telling you that it's what people believe. What would settle the matter in your opinion? Clara asked. Not sarcastically. She genuinely wanted to know what Eleanor thought the answer was. Eleanor seemed surprised by the directness. If your arrangement were more, she searched for the word, transparent. If there were a formal accounting of your role here. If Cole spoke publicly about the nature of the arrangement. Mr. Mercer is welcome to discuss his business arrangements publicly whenever he chooses, Clara said. That's his decision to make, not mine. As for references, I brought documentation of my previous placements to the interview. The agency's records are available to anyone who contacts them in Tucson. My work here is documented in the ranch's accounts, which have improved substantially in the 2 months I've been working. She paused. I can't make people believe what the evidence shows. I can only show it. Francis was no longer looking at the painting. Eleanor studied Clara for a moment. Something shifted in her expression. Not a retreat exactly, but an adjustment. You're not what I expected, she said. What did you expect? A brief silence. I'm not entirely sure, Eleanor admitted, and for a moment she sounded almost rueful. They had tea, which Clara made herself, and the conversation moved to the ranch, and then to the valley, and then to a water dispute that had affected 3 properties north of town in the spring, a conversation during which Clara said very little but listened to everything. By the time Eleanor and Francis left, something had not been resolved but had been, perhaps, set onto a different trajectory. Cole came home to find Clara in the kitchen with 2 teacups washed and drying on the rack, and a look on her face that he'd learned to read as something happened that I'm still deciding how to think about. Eleanor Caldwell came to call, Clara said. Cole took off his hat. What did she want? To assess me. Clara poured him coffee from the pot on the stove. And to warn me, I think, in the way people warn others when they believe they're doing them a kindness. What did you tell her? The truth. She handed him the cup. I don't know if it helped. With Eleanor, it takes time. He drank. She came to Margaret first, too, assessed her, decided she was acceptable about 6 months in. Clara raised an eyebrow. Margaret had to earn Eleanor Caldwell's approval? Everyone does. He almost smiled. You're doing it faster than most. Clara looked at him for a moment. How do you know? She sent word with her houseman this afternoon, inviting you to the Caldwell house for dinner next week. He put the cup down. Eleanor Caldwell doesn't invite people to dinner until she's decided they're worth the china. Clara was quiet. Something moved across her face that might have been relief, or might have been something more complicated. I'll go, she said. I know you will. He picked up his coffee again. She's going to ask you about your plans. Eleanor always does. She'll want to know if you intend to stay. Clara looked at the kitchen. The account stacked on the table, the corrected water rights copy in the leather case on the shelf, the copper pots that had gone from tarnished to clean in 2 months. I'll tell her that depends on a number of things. That's a politician's answer. It's an honest answer. She sat down across from him. Cole, the Granger situation is going to escalate. I want you to understand that before it happens, not after. He looked at her over the rim of the cup. Tell me. He knows I found the water rights issue and had it corrected. He'll know that within the week if he doesn't already. The county clerk's filing is public record. Whatever he was planning to build on that weakness, that option is gone. She was choosing her words carefully, not to soften the information, but to make it precise. That means he needs a new approach, and a man with his resources and patience doesn't take a setback like that and do nothing. He'll come at us differently. He'll come at everything differently. She put her hands flat on the table. The agency complaint was his first move after he realized I'd found the pattern. It didn't work. His second move will be something else. I don't know what yet. The kitchen lamp cast a steady orange light across the table, across the documents, across the two of them sitting across from each other in the silence that had gradually stopped being uncomfortable and become something else. The comfortable kind of quiet that only happens between people who have stopped needing to perform for each other. You could leave, Cole said. The Granger complaint gives you a legitimate out. You could go back to Tucson and say the situation became too complicated and nobody would fault you. I know that, Claire said, but you're not going to. No. She looked at him steadily. I'm not. He didn't ask why. She thought maybe he already knew, which was either very convenient or something she should think about more carefully later. The following week brought two things that Clara had not anticipated, which was unusual enough to unsettle her. She prided herself on anticipating most things. The first was a visit from a man named Roy Teller, who identified himself as a land assessor employed by the Granger Land Company. He arrived at the ranch gate on a Monday morning while Cole was in town at the bank, and Dan Purcell was out with the North Herd. Bert let him in because the man had a document from the county assessor's office, and Bert was not equipped to evaluate whether that document was legitimate or merely official-looking. Clara met Roy Teller in the front yard. He was in his 40s, compact and businesslike, with the particular manner of someone who delivers bad news for a living and has found a way to make peace with it. He showed her the county document. It was a request for assessment, technically legal, though the grounds were thin, related to the debt instrument the Granger Company had acquired. We're required to conduct a preliminary evaluation of the property as part of our debt documentation process, he said. He was polite about it. That was almost worse. The debt instrument in question, Clara said, represents less than 1% of the assessed value of this property. A physical assessment would be disproportionate to any legitimate documentation need. Teller looked at her. He adjusted his assessment. She could see it happen in the small shift of his expression. He'd expected a housekeeper or a secretary. You're familiar with the instrument. I'm the estate manager, she said. I'm familiar with every financial instrument associated with this property. Then you'll know that the terms allow for periodic assessment requests. They allow for documentation requests, she said, not physical assessments. The language is specific. Would you like me to get the document? Teller was quiet for a moment. That's a fine distinction. It's the only distinction that matters legally. She looked at him, not unkindly, because he was doing a job he'd been sent to do and probably had limited enthusiasm for it. Mister Teller, if the Granger Company has a legitimate documentation need, send a written request to the ranch's legal representative and it will be answered appropriately. But I'm not going to allow a physical walkthrough of this property on the basis of a document that doesn't authorize one. He held her gaze, then he put his papers back in his case. I'll convey that to my employer. Please do. He left. Claire stood in the front yard until the wagon was through the gate. Then she went inside and sat at the kitchen table for about 5 minutes doing nothing, which was unusual for her. Then she pulled out paper and wrote a very precise letter to the ranch's legal representative in Phoenix, describing the visit and requesting a formal review of the debt instrument's terms. She also, on reflection, wrote a second letter to her contact at the county assessor's office, a woman she'd met at the filing office who had been helpful and who, Clara had assessed, was uncomfortable with how the county's resources were being used in certain directions. The letter asked specific questions about the frequency of assessment requests from the Granger Land Company across multiple properties in the past 3 years. The second unexpected development that week came not from Granger, but from Dan Purcell, who knocked on the study door on Wednesday evening and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and a look that Clara had not seen from him before. Not the stubborn reserve she'd gotten used to, not the reluctant respect that had developed over the months. Something closer to trouble. I need to talk to you, he said. Not Cole. You. Clara put down her pen. All right. Dan came in and sat down in the chair across from the desk, which he'd never done before. He was a man who conducted conversations standing up, a preference she'd noticed. The fact that he sat down told her something about what was coming. "I've been here 12 years, he said. "Worked under Cole's father for 3 before that. This ranch is—" He stopped working through it. "There are people in town saying Cole's losing his grip, that he's being managed, that a woman from somewhere else has got her hooks into the operation and he can't see it." Clara was quiet. "I know that's not what's happening," Dan said. "I know the books better than I knew them 5 years ago, and I know why. I know the East Pasture is producing, and I know the supply system is clean, and I know it's because of you." He turned his hat in his hands. "But people are saying it, and the reason I'm telling you instead of Cole is that Cole will hear it and get angry at the people saying it, and that won't help. Whereas you—" He paused. "You figure out what to do with information." "Who's saying it?" she asked. Not defensively, just gathering information. "Hale at the feed store. The Blythe brothers, who've got the Eastern grazing leases. And—" Dan stopped. And Silas Granger was in town last week. He was at the Stockmen's Club. He had dinner with 3 of the independent ranch owners from the North Valley. Dan met her eyes. "He's been talking to people, Clara. Not threatening. Just talking. Suggesting that the Mercer operation is becoming unstable. That there might be opportunities for neighboring properties to consolidate resources before things get complicated." Clara folded her hands. "He's building a narrative." "Yes." Dan looked at his hat. "A man like Granger, he doesn't need to threaten anyone. He just needs to create uncertainty. Enough people start wondering if the Mercer Ranch is in trouble, and the trouble starts to become real even if it wasn't before. Because creditors get nervous, partners get cautious, buyers stay away. And small operators start thinking maybe the safe play is to deal with Granger before the Mercer situation shakes up the whole valley." Dan finally put his hat on his knee, stopped turning it. "He's smart." "He is," Clara agreed. "What do we do?" She looked at the desk for a moment, at the papers and the letters and the ledgers and the account books that she'd spent 2 months turning from a record of slow decline into something different, at the copy of the corrected water rights agreement in the leather case on the shelf, at the letter she'd just written to the county assessor contact. "The narrative only works if people don't have a counter-narrative," she said. "He's telling a story about instability. We need to show the actual story, what this ranch has done in the past 2 months, what the numbers say, what the operation looks like to anyone who cares to examine it honestly." She looked at Dan. "Who are the 3 ranch owners he had dinner with?" "Polk, from up near the ridge. The Castillo brothers, who run the Dos Rios operation, and Henry Alderman from the Alderman River Ranch." Dan paused. "Independent men. They've stayed clear of Granger so far." "Then they're not his yet," Clara said, "and they're not convinced yet. They're at dinner because they're nervous, and he was offering them a chair and a meal and someone to listen." She picked up her pen. "We need to talk to them, not to sell them anything, just to give them a look at what this operation actually is, so they can make their own judgment." Dan looked at her for a moment. "Cole should be the one to do that. They respect Cole. Cole should absolutely be the one to do that," she agreed. "But he's going to need to know what to tell them. And he's going to need to know that the information he's presenting is solid enough to withstand a challenge from a man with Granger's resources." She was already writing. Dan watched her for a moment, and then he did something he'd never done before. He said quietly, with the simplicity of someone who didn't make statements like this easily, "You care about this ranch." Clara didn't look up from what she was writing. "I care about what's right," she said. Dan picked up his hat and stood. At the door he stopped. "That's the same thing," he said, "in this case." He left. Clara wrote for another hour, and the lamp burned down, and outside the window the November night was cold and clear all the way to the horizon. The letters from Clara's contact at the county assessor's office arrived on a Friday morning, and they were more than Clara had expected. She read them at the kitchen table before Cole came down, once through quickly and then again slowly, making notes in the margin of her own paper as she went. By the time she heard his boots on the stairs, she had a clear picture of something she'd suspected but hadn't been able to prove. A pattern of assessment requests filed by Granger Land Company subsidiaries against 7 different independent properties in the valley over the past 4 years. Not all of them had resulted in acquisitions. 2 had. 2 others had resulted in what the county records listed as voluntary consolidation agreements, which was the kind of language that meant something had happened, but the record wasn't going to tell you exactly what. The remaining 3 were ongoing, the Mercer Ranch debt instrument among them. 7 properties. 4 years. All of it done through subsidiary companies with different names, so that no single filing looked connected to any other. Clara set the letters on the table when Cole walked in and said, "Sit down. I have something to show you." He poured his coffee first. He was a man who needed coffee before he could absorb bad news, which she'd learned in the same way she'd learned most things about him, through observation rather than conversation. He sat across from her with the cup and looked at the letters. She walked him through it methodically. The 7 properties, the timeline, the subsidiary names, and how they traced back. The 2 acquisitions. The 2 consolidation agreements, one of which had involved the Blythe family's eastern grazing operation, which explained, Clara noted, why the Blythe brothers were among the people in town repeating the story about the Mercer Ranch becoming unstable. The Blythes had already been absorbed into Granger's orbit and probably didn't even fully understand how it had happened. Cole read everything she put in front of him without interrupting. When he finished, he sat with his coffee and was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough that Clara began to wonder if she'd delivered it wrong. Too much at once. Too clinical. Then he said, "He's been doing this since before Margaret died." "Yes." "The first filing here is from 4 years ago. Margaret was sick, but she was still—" He stopped. "She was still here." He wasn't targeting the Mercer Ranch specifically at that point, as far as I can tell, Clara said. The early filings were smaller operations, properties that were more vulnerable. She kept her voice level. The Mercer Ranch became a priority more recently, probably in the past 18 months. When I stopped paying attention, she didn't answer that directly, because there wasn't a useful way to answer it. It was true, and he knew it was true, and saying yes would be accurate but unkind, and saying no would be dishonest, so she just let the silence hold it. "The Alderman River Ranch," Cole said. He was still looking at the letters. "Henry Alderman. He's on this list." The Granger Company filed a documentation request against his property 2 years ago. It was resolved. The record shows a payment was made, which suggests Henry settled some kind of claim. She paused. That may be why he was at the dinner last week. If Granger already has some kind of hold over the Alderman operation, Henry might not be as free to choose as he appears. Cole set down the coffee cup. "And Polk? And the Castillo brothers?" "Nothing in the county records, which means they're still independent, still making their own decisions." She folded her hands. "Which is why we need to talk to them before Granger does it again." Cole nodded slowly. It was the nod of a man assembling a plan rather than agreeing to a suggestion. "I'll ride out to the Castillo Ranch today. They're the closer operation. Polk is 3 hours north, and I can go Thursday." "Take Dan," Clara said. "He knows both families personally, and take the production numbers from the past 2 months. Don't just tell them the Mercer operation is stable. Show them." "You're not coming?" She considered it. "No, not for this first conversation." She looked at him directly. "You're the one they know. You're the one who carries weight in the valley. I'm the person Granger's narrative has already targeted. If I come along, the conversation becomes about me instead of about the ranch." Cole was quiet for a moment. "That bothers you?" "It's practical," she said. Being bothered by it doesn't change it." He looked at her as that way he had sometimes, like he was reading something that wasn't quite on the surface. "You could have handled this differently," he said. "From the beginning. You could have been less visible. Let me be the one presenting everything, taking a quieter role. People would have found you easier to accept." "People would have found a quieter version of me easier to accept," she said. "That's not the same thing as me being easier to accept." A corner of his mouth shifted. "No," he said. "It's not." Cole and Dan rode to the Castillo Ranch that afternoon. Clara spent the day at the desk in the study, working through the filing history she'd assembled and looking for anything she might have missed. She found 2 things of minor significance and 1 thing that was not minor at all. The water agreement she'd had corrected at the county clerk's office, the 1887 document with the upstream flow clause, had not simply been re-registered with the clause omitted. A duplicate filing existed, dated 2 months after the Granger re-registration, under a different case number. The duplicate was almost identical to the corrected version except for one line in the fourth paragraph, which defined the geographic scope of the water rights in language that was subtly but significantly different from the original. The change was the kind of thing you'd miss if you were reading quickly. A boundary description that used a creek bend as a landmark rather than a measured distance, which meant the boundary would shift depending on where the creek ran in a given year. In a dry year, the creek bend moved. In a very dry year, it moved significantly. Clara sat with this for a long time. Then she pulled out her map of the valley and looked at the creek's recorded positions over the past 20 years. In the drought of 1889, the creek bend had shifted almost 300 yards north. 300 yards, she calculated with careful measurement against the map's scale, was enough to put Mercer Ranch's upstream water claim outside the protected boundary. The duplicate filing was designed to collapse in a drought, and the territory of Arizona, according to the weather pattern record she'd been reading as part of the water rights research, ran on roughly 7-year cycles. The last significant drought had been 1889, which meant the next one was statistically likely within the next 2 years. She wrote this down. She organized the documents in the sequence that made the argument clearest, and then she sat back in the chair and thought about Silas Granger, a man she'd never met, who had been building a mechanism designed to operate over years and activate during a natural disaster, and felt something she rarely let herself feel about an adversary, which was a reluctant respect for the scale of the thinking. It was a cold kind of respect, but it was there. Cole came back from the Castillo Ranch at dusk with Dan and the specific look of a man who has had a complicated conversation and isn't yet sure what to make of it. Miguel Castillo listened, he said. He and Clara were in the study, Dan having gone to the barn. He didn't commit to anything, but he listened and he looked at the numbers, and he didn't say what I expected him to say. What did you expect? I expected him to tell me he appreciated the visit and he'd think about it, and that'd be the end of it. Cole leaned against the desk. Instead, he asked me 3 specific questions about the water rights situation. He already knew something was going on with the upstream claims. He'd heard about it, not from Granger directly, from a man at the Stockman's Club who'd heard something from the county office. Clara felt the familiar tightening of something she'd call alarm if she were less disciplined about her vocabulary. What had he heard? That there was a dispute over the Mercer upstream rights, that it was unresolved. Cole met her eyes. Someone at the county office is talking. Hewitt, she said. It wasn't a guess. Probably. He's not a strong man. Cole paused. The story that's circulating is that the water rights situation is complicated and the Mercer Ranch's claim may not hold, which is the opposite of the truth. We filed the correction, it's documented, the claim is solid. But the duplicate filing isn't common knowledge, Clara said. And the drought clause is buried in technical language that most people wouldn't understand. If someone wanted to create uncertainty about the Mercer water claim, all they'd need to do is reference the existence of multiple conflicting filings without explaining the substance. She looked at him, which is exactly the kind of technically true misleading statement that Granger has built his entire approach around. Cole was quiet. Show me what you found today. She showed him. She walked him through the duplicate filing, the boundary description, the creek bend, the drought calculation. He followed it. Cole Mercer was not a lawyer and had never pretended to be. But he was a man who understood land, and once she explained what the creek bend landmark meant in a dry year, his face went through a sequence of expressions that ended at something tight and controlled. He planned for a drought, Cole said. He planned for everything, Clara said. That's who we're dealing with. Cole stood up from the desk and walked to the window. Outside, the last of the evening light was going and the first stars were showing. Clara watched his back and waited. What do we need? He said. To beat this completely. Not just to hold our position, to end it. We need 3 things, she said. First, the duplicate filing challenged and struck from the record. That requires a lawyer, and it requires presenting the original 1887 document against the duplicate clearly enough that the clerk's irregularity is undeniable. She paused. Second, the debt instrument paid off or legally challenged as having been acquired in bad faith, which is harder to prove but not impossible given the timeline and the pattern of other acquisitions. And third, she took a breath. Third, we need the independent ranchers in this valley to understand what Granger is doing before he gets to each of them individually, not just the Castillos. All of them. If every independent operation understands the pattern, he loses the ability to approach them one at a time with his version of the story. Cole turned from the window. You want to bring the valley together. I want to give people accurate information, she said carefully. What they do with it is their own decision. That's a bigger undertaking than fixing my books, he said. Yes. It's going to put you in a position where you're very visible, where Granger can't pretend your work here is just housekeeping. I know. And you still think it's the right move. I think it's the only move that solves the problem instead of delaying it. She looked at him steadily. A man who builds mechanisms like this doesn't stop if you defend against one of them. He finds the next angle. The only thing that changes the equation is removing his ability to isolate people. Cole held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, All right, but we do it together. You and me both, every conversation. I'm not going to let you carry this in front of people while I stand behind you. Something moved through her. Not quite surprise, more like the recognition of something she hadn't quite let herself expect. That's going to add to the gossip, she said. Let it, he said. Eleanor Caldwell already invited you to dinner. The social war isn't going to get worse than it already is. You might be wrong about that. I'm sometimes wrong about things, he said. Not this. The campaign to reach the valley's independent ranchers, though neither of them called it that, because naming it felt like tempting something, began quietly and moved faster than Clara had planned, which was both encouraging and concerning. Cole knew everyone. That was the simple fact that she'd understood abstractly, but hadn't fully appreciated until she watched him work. He knew the Castillo brothers' grandfather's name and which pasture their father had broken ground on first. He knew that George Polk had a running dispute with his neighbor over a fence line that had nothing to do with Granger, but made Polk suspicious of any claim that started with a boundary question. He knew that the widow Reyes, whose family ran the smallest independent operation in the valley south of town, had turned down 2 purchase offers in the past 3 years and would turn down a third on principle alone. Clara provided the evidence. Cole provided the relationships. It was the most effective working arrangement she'd been part of, and she was honest enough with herself to admit that she hadn't expected it, had expected to have to compensate for his gaps in the same way she'd compensated in previous positions, where the landowner was well-meaning but limited. Cole Mercer was not limited. He'd been distracted, which was different. With his attention restored and directed, he was formidable in ways the operation's past 3 years had hidden. They spent the first week of December riding to 6 separate properties. The conversations varied. Some went long, some were cautious and brief. A few were immediately warm. Miguel Castillo, true to the measured response Cole had described, asked 2 more questions about the water rights situation, and then said, without drama, "Tell me what you need, and I'll consider it." But George Polk was prickly in the first 20 minutes, and then abruptly direct once he understood the pattern of subsidiary filings. He did the same thing to the Blythe brothers? I saw them at the Stockman's Club last month, and they looked like men who'd agreed to something they weren't sure about. The widow Reyes offered them lunch and said she'd known something was wrong with Granger's approach for 2 years and was glad someone was finally naming it out loud. Henry Alderman was different. They drove to the Alderman River Ranch on a Thursday, on a day when the temperature had dropped enough that their breath showed in the air. Henry Alderman met them at his front gate rather than inviting them in, which was telling. A man standing at his own gate in the cold to conduct a conversation was a man who didn't want the conversation inside his house, where his wife might hear. Henry was in his 60s, weather-worn and deliberate in his movements. He'd been a respected figure in the valley for decades. Looking at him now, Clara could see the marks of something. Not age exactly, but the particular weight of a man who has compromised in a way he can't quite talk about. "Cole," he said. He nodded at Clara. "Miss Ashford." "Henry." Cole shook his hand. "We're talking to the independent ranchers in the valley about Granger. We'd like your view of things." Alderman was quiet for a moment. He looked at the road, at the gray December sky, at the bare ground. "I expect you know my situation." "We know what the county records show," Clara said. "We don't know the full story." Alderman looked at her. He had the look of a man who was deciding whether a particular honesty was available to him. 2 years ago, I had a cash flow problem. Spring cattle prices came in low, and I had a payment due on the North Pasture expansion loan. Granger's company bought the note from my creditor and offered me terms I could manage." He paused. They've been, he searched for the word, correct about the terms. No pressure, no unreasonable demands. That's how it works at first, Clara said. Not unkindly, just stating it. Alderman looked at her for a long moment. You think they're waiting? I think they're patient, she said. I think the terms will remain correct until there's a reason for them not to be. A bad season. A second cash problem. Another drought. She paused. What happens to your note in a drought year, Mr. Alderman? Have you read the terms carefully? Something moved across Alderman's face that she recognized. The particular expression of a man who has read something once and signed it and has been carefully not rereading it since. There's a clause about reassessment, he said, if the property value assessment changes significantly. Due to ishas, drought conditions. He said it quietly. Clara reached into her case and pulled out the document she'd prepared. The Granger subsidiary filing pattern. The drought calculation she'd worked out. The Creek Bend analysis. She handed it to him. He took it and read it with the slow care of a man who has just realized something he'd been avoiding realizing. Cole said nothing. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and let the silence and the documents do what they needed to do. Alderman read to the end. He folded the papers. He looked out over his north pasture, the expansion he'd borrowed to build, the land that now had Granger's name on a piece of paper in a county filing office. What are you asking for? He said. Nothing from you directly, Cole said. Not yet, but I want you to understand what's in front of you, and I want you to know that we're talking to everyone in this valley about the same thing. You're not alone in it. Alderman was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I went to that dinner with Granger. I know. He didn't threaten me. He was pleasant, actually. Talked about the valley, about the challenges of independent operation, about how consolidation could be beneficial for everyone. Alderman turned the papers over in his hands. He said the Mercer Ranch was in trouble, that there was a management situation that was creating instability. Cole's jaw tightened slightly. And I didn't believe it, but I didn't have anything to hold against it either, because nobody from the Mercer Ranch was telling me anything. He finally looked directly at Cole. I've known you 15 years, Cole. You should have come to me sooner. You're right, Cole said. I should have. It wasn't an excuse. It wasn't an explanation. Alderman looked at him for a moment and nodded once, the nod of two men who understood each other well enough to move past a thing without belaboring it. I'll talk to my lawyer, Alderman said. About the note. Talk to ours too if you want, Cole said. We're already working on the Granger subsidiary pattern. The more properties that are challenging these instruments at the same time, the harder it is to pick them off one by one. Alderman looked at the documents again, then at Clara. You put all this together. The research, yes, she said. Cole and Dan identified the relationships. You're the one who found the drought clause. I'm the one who had time to read carefully, she said. Most people don't. Alderman made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh, dry and brief. Come inside, he said. My wife makes good coffee. They were back at the ranch by late afternoon, and the energy between them on the drive home was different from the cautious, careful quality of the earlier part of the campaign. Something had shifted in the alderman conversation. Some threshold had been crossed, where the effort stopped feeling like managing a crisis and started feeling like building something. Dan was waiting for them in the yard with an expression that said news had arrived while they were gone. Telegram from Phoenix, he said. Your lawyer. Cole took it and read it. He handed it to Clara without comment. The Granger Land Company had filed a legal challenge to the corrected water rights registration. They were claiming the original 1887 agreement was improperly executed due to a notarial deficiency, a technical argument about whether the original notary had been properly licensed in the territory at the time of filing. It was, Clara recognized immediately, a claim designed not to win in court, but to create delay. To put a cloud on those water rights while the legal argument wound through the system. To manufacture uncertainty. They're not trying to win this one, she said. They're trying to freeze it. How long does a challenge like this take to resolve? Cole asked. 6 months minimum. A year if they contest every step. She looked at the telegram. And during that year, the cloud on the title affects everything: loans, partnerships, any transaction that requires clean title documentation. They're trying to freeze the operation, Cole said. While the drought comes, she said. If the records about the 7-year cycle hold, we're looking at dry conditions within 18 months. If the water rights are legally contested when that happens, the duplicate filings drought clause kicks in, and the legal challenge means we can't easily clear it in time. She handed the telegram back. It's coordinated. The challenge was filed this week, right after the county records would have shown our corrected filing and our conversations with the Castillos. Cole folded the telegram. He was doing the thing where he went very still and looked like a man taking inventory. But this time there was something different in his stillness. Not the shut-down quality she'd observed in the early months, the grief stillness that was a form of absence. This was focused, present. He knows we're organizing, Cole said. He's watching the county filings, the same way I was watching his. She paused. He knows we're talking to people. Then we need to talk faster. We need to talk smarter, Claire said. Speed matters. But the argument we bring to the county hearing, because that's where this ends, in a public hearing, needs to be airtight. We can't just have the independent ranchers showing up. We need documented evidence, legal standing, and the water agreement argument to be so clear that the challenge looks like what it is. Which is harassment, she said. Coordinated, systematic harassment of independent property owners using legal mechanisms as weapons. She paused. There are territorial statutes that speak to that, not strongly, but they exist. Dan, who had been standing quietly through this exchange, said, "You think you can make that argument stick?" "I think I can build it well enough that a county hearing will have to take it seriously," Clara said. "Whether it sticks depends on factors I can't fully control. The judge, the political climate, how many property owners we have standing with us by the time we get there." She looked at both of them. "It's not a guaranteed win. I want to be honest about that." "Not a guaranteed win," Cole said, "but it's what we've got." "It's what we've got," she agreed. Dan nodded. "When do we need to be ready?" "The legal challenge gives us a window. They've started the process, which means there will be a scheduled hearing date. We probably have 8 to 12 weeks before that date is set." She did the calculation, which means we have 6 weeks to complete the coalition and prepare the documentation because we'll need 2 weeks minimum with the lawyer before the hearing. 6 weeks, Dan said, if we're efficient. Dan put his hat back on. "I'll go talk to the Reyes family again tomorrow," he said. "They were warm. I think they'll commit." He looked at Cole. "And Polk. He's prickly, but he's honest. He'll come if he believes the argument." He walked toward the barn. Cole and Clara stood in the yard in the early evening cold. "You didn't sleep much last night," Cole said. She looked at him. She hadn't thought he'd noticed. "I was working through the filing analysis." "You need to sleep." "I will. Clara." His voice had that particular quality it had taken on over the months. Direct, but with something under it that wasn't purely professional. "You can't manage this if you wear yourself down. It's a long road." "I know that." "Do you?" He looked at her in the fading light. "Because in every operation I've ever run, the person who thinks they can outwork everyone else is also the first person to make a mistake when it matters most." She held his gaze. "Speaking from experience?" "Speaking from the past 3 years," he said, "which I outworked everything except the thing I actually needed to deal with." It was the most direct thing he'd ever said about Margaret's death and the years after. Not a confession, not an opening, just a fact laid down quietly in the yard between them. Clara said, "I'll sleep tonight." "Good." He looked toward the house. "Come in. I'll make something for dinner." She nearly said, "That's my job," and stopped herself, because it wasn't. It never had been. And they both knew that now. She followed him inside into the warm kitchen, into the house that had gone from a cave to something that felt, incrementally and imperfectly, like a place people lived. Outside, the cold December night settled over the valley. 7 properties were now part of a conversation that Silas Granger had not anticipated. A legal challenge had been filed that would require a public hearing. A pattern of coordinated interference spanning 4 years had been documented and organized and was waiting for its moment. The war in the valley had not started that day. It had been running for years without most of the people in it knowing they were in it. But something had changed in the past few months, in the space between a woman arriving uninvited at a gate with 2 leather bags and what the valley's independent ranchers were beginning to understand about the shape of the threat they faced. Cole Mercer cooked supper in his own kitchen on a December evening, and Clara Ashford sat at the table with the documents she was still working through, and neither of them talked about what the next months were going to cost. Some things are better faced without naming them all at once. But the work continued, and the lamp burned, and the papers filled up with careful handwriting, and somewhere in the valley, Silas Granger was looking at a county record that told him the Mercer operation was not going to roll over, and making the calculations of a patient man who believed he could still win. He was not, as yet, wrong about that, but he was running out of time to be right. The hearing date arrived in the county records on a Wednesday morning, posted without ceremony in the public notices the way all significant things in Sulphur Creek were posted, on a single sheet of paper tacked to the board outside the courthouse, between a notice about stray livestock and an advertisement for a dentist in Tucson. Clara saw it on her way out of the clerk's office, where she'd been confirming the status of their legal challenge response. She stood on the courthouse steps in the January cold and read it twice. February 14th, 6 weeks away. She walked back to the wagon where Cole was waiting and told him the date. He looked at her and said nothing for a moment, the way he did when he was counting something out in his head. 6 weeks, he said. We have 4 of the 7 independent ranchers committed. Polk is leaning yes, but hasn't said it out loud yet. The Reyes family is in if Polk comes in. Maria Reyes told Dan she'd follow Polk's lead because they've been neighbors for 20 years, and she doesn't want to be on a different side of the fence from him. She got up into the wagon. Alderman is the one I'm not sure about. Henry'll come, Cole said. He picked up the reins. He just needs time to make peace with what it means for his note situation. We don't have much time left. I know. He turned the wagon toward the ranch road. Let me talk to him alone. Just Henry and me. No documents, no legal arguments, just 2 men who've known each other 15 years. Clara considered this. There were situations where evidence was the right tool and situations where it wasn't, and she'd learned over the months that Cole had a better read than she did on which was which when it came to the human landscape of the valley. All right, she said. The ride back was quiet. The January landscape was stripped and spare, the mountains to the north carrying a thin skin of snow that hadn't melted in a week. Clara sat with her hands in her lap and thought about the February 14th deadline the way she thought about most serious problems. By working backward from the date and assigning tasks to the available days, accounting for the unknown variables, and building in margins where she could. What she couldn't fully account for, and knew it, was Granger's next move. He'd been quiet since the legal challenge filing, not inactive. She knew from the county records that 2 additional documentation requests had gone out to small properties in the valley's northern section, smaller operations than any of the 7 she'd already mapped, which suggested either a new line of pressure or simply routine maintenance of his existing campaign. But he hadn't escalated against the Mercer Ranch directly, and the silence had the quality of something building rather than something retreating. She said this to Cole when they got back to the ranch, and he asked what was on her mind. He's waiting for something, she said. A man who's been this patient for this long doesn't go quiet because he's given up. He goes quiet because he's decided the next move needs to be larger, and he's preparing it. What would the next move be? If I were him? She looked at the papers spread across the kitchen table. I try to split the coalition before it gets to the hearing. Approach 1 or 2 of the ranchers individually and offer them a way out, terms on their existing dealings that seem generous. Make it attractive enough that they break from the group rather than risk a public legal fight. She paused. And I'd try to discredit the argument by attacking the person making it. Cole looked at her across the table. You. The water rights analysis, the subsidiary mapping, that's all my work. If he can establish that the person who assembled the evidence is unreliable or motivated by something other than the rancher's interests, the argument loses its foundation. She said it flatly, as information rather than complaint. He's already tried the agency complaint. That didn't work. The next version will be something harder to dismiss. Like what? I don't know yet. She straightened a stack of papers that didn't need straightening. Something personal, probably. Something that makes people in this county question my history or my intentions. She paused. Does it matter if it's true? He looked at her. Of course it matters. I mean, in terms of impact. A false accusation with enough specificity gets repeated. By the time it's disproved, the hearing is over. Cole was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the particular careful quality of someone saying something they'd thought about before having the conversation. Clara, is there anything in your past that he could use? I'm not asking because I think there is. I'm asking because if there is, I should know about it before the hearing. She looked at him steadily. No criminal record, no lawsuits, no professional complaints that were sustained, one that was filed and dismissed in New Mexico by the household employee I mentioned, the one who'd been stealing linens. She filed a complaint against me with the Territory Labor Board, and it was dismissed for lack of evidence. She paused. It might be enough for Granger's purposes, even dismissed. The existence of a complaint sounds bad in summary. Then we get ahead of it, Cole said. If he uses it, we have the dismissal documentation ready. We'd need to explain the context quickly enough that the narrative doesn't set before we can counter it. Then we explain it now, before the hearing, to Eleanor. He saw her expression. Eleanor Caldwell knows everyone in this county who matters to public opinion. If she knows the true story before Granger's version circulates, she can counter it herself, which carries more weight than us defending it. Clara sat with this. It required trusting Eleanor Caldwell with something that felt private, which went against a lifelong habit of keeping her professional history contained. But she recognized the logic, and she'd learned over the months that her instinct to manage everything herself was not always right. That's good thinking, she said. Occasionally I have some, he said. She almost smiled. Cole rode to the Alderman River Ranch on a Friday, alone as he'd said, and came back in the early afternoon with the look of a man who has had the conversation he needed to have and is still sitting with the weight of it. Clara was in the barn talking to Dan about the North herd when she heard the wagon, and she watched Cole drive in and unhitch the horse with the slow movements of someone whose mind is elsewhere. She finished what she was saying to Dan and walked over. "How did it go?" she said. Cole led the horse into the stall and latched the gate before he answered. "Henry's in, but it cost him something to decide it, and I want you to know that." He turned around. His note situation is worse than the county records showed. There's a second instrument, private, not filed publicly, that Granger's company holds. Henry's been carrying it for a year. If he stands with us at the hearing and we lose, Granger can call both notes simultaneously, and Henry loses the north expansion and possibly the main house. Clara felt the weight of that. He knows that, and he's still coming. He said, Cole stopped. He looked at the barn floor. He said Margaret used to say that the kind of decision you make when it's expensive is the only one that tells you anything true about yourself. He paused. He and Margaret were friends. I didn't know that as well as I should have. The barn was quiet except for the horses. Clara stood there with the particular feeling of grief, not hers and not Cole's specifically, but the kind that moves through communities like water through ground. The residual grief of a woman who had been a presence in this valley and whose absence was still being discovered in unexpected places. "We're not going to lose," Clara said. Cole looked at her. "You're not certain of that?" "No, but I'm close enough." She paused. "Henry coming, that's not just one more rancher. He's been in this valley for 30 years. He's the one Granger already had a hold on, and he's choosing the other side anyway. That changes the story." She looked at Cole. "People will hear that and understand what it means." Cole nodded slowly. "Polk called the hearing a test," he said. "When I spoke to him last week, he said something like, a test of whether the valley can hold itself together against something that's been trying to pull it apart piece by piece." He picked up the brush and started grooming the horse, a habit he had when he was thinking. He used that exact phrase, pull it apart piece by piece. He understood it before I finished explaining it. "Because it's what's been happening to him too," Claire said. "Maybe he didn't have documents or legal analysis to explain it, but he's been feeling the pressure for years. They all have. Granger's approach only works as long as each person believes they're the only one dealing with it. And now they know they're not. Now they know." Cole brushed the horse in long strokes. After a moment he said, "You should talk to Eleanor tomorrow." "I know. I'll come with you." "You don't need Clara." He didn't stop brushing. "I'm coming." She let it go. Eleanor Caldwell's sitting room was warmer than Clara expected. Not in temperature, but in the sense of a room that was genuinely lived in, books stacked on side tables, a wool throw on the arm of one chair, a half-finished piece of needlework left without ceremony on the ottoman. Eleanor herself brought the coffee in herself rather than calling someone, which Clara noted as another kind of warmth. Cole and Clara sat across from Eleanor, and Cole said without preamble, "We need to tell you something before it gets told wrong." Eleanor looked at Clara. "Is this about the New Mexico placement complaint?" Clara went very still. "You already know. A man came to see me last week," Eleanor said. She poured coffee with a steady hand. "He didn't introduce himself, which I found rude. He said he was representing business interests that were concerned about the Mercer Ranch situation, and he wanted me to know that the woman managing Cole's estate had a history of professional complaints in other territories." She handed Clara a cup. "He seemed to think I would find that information useful." "What did you tell him?" Cole said. "I told him that I would be happy to discuss any concerns he had in writing, with his name attached, and that anyone who delivered information anonymously was selling something I wasn't buying." Eleanor sat back with her own cup. "Then I looked into it myself. I have a connection in the New Mexico territory through my husband's business, and that connection confirmed the complaint was filed and dismissed." She looked at Clara. "It was a dismissed complaint filed by a woman you'd caught stealing, is that correct?" "Yes," Clara said. "Then it's not a story that damages you," Eleanor said. "It's a story that confirms you do your job." She paused. "What concerns me is that someone went to the trouble of researching your history and delivering a sanitized version of it to me specifically, hoping I'd spread it. Which means someone knows I'm connected enough in this community that my opinion shapes other opinions. They know you'd be the one person who could turn public sentiment against Clara before the hearing," Cole said. Eleanor held his gaze. "And instead of coming to me directly and letting me ask questions, this person delivered a partial truth to a back channel, hoping I'd fill in the rest myself." She set her cup down. "That tells me something about how they conduct their business generally." She paused. "Is it Granger?" "We believe the approach came from his organization," Clara said carefully. "We can't prove he authorized it personally." "I don't need proof of that kind to form a judgment of character," Eleanor said. "I need enough to understand what's happening." She looked at them both. "Tell me everything, from the beginning." They did. Clara laid out the documents she'd brought. The subsidiary pattern, the drought clause, the filing irregularities, Alderman's note situation, the complete picture. Eleanor listened with the focused attention of someone who processed information quickly and didn't need things repeated. She asked 3 questions, all of them sharp and specific. When Clara finished, Eleanor sat for a moment with her hands folded. "You're going to the hearing February 14th, she said. "Yes," Cole said, "and you have 6 ranch families prepared to stand with you." 7, including us, Clara said, "and possibly more if the families in the northern section respond to Dan's outreach this week." Eleanor looked at her needlework on the ottoman, then at the window. It was the look of a woman running calculations that she didn't need paper to work out. "What do you need from me?" "The truth to be in circulation before the hearing," Cole said. "Not a campaign, just the real story available to the people in this county who make up their minds based on what they hear from people they trust." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "You're asking me to do what I already do?" "I suppose I am." "Then you're asking the right person." She picked up the needlework. "Go home. Prepare your legal argument. I'll handle what I can handle." She looked at Clara. "And Miss Ashford, I owe you an apology." Clara looked at her. "You don't." "I was slow to extend good faith," Eleanor said. "I had reasons I thought were sound. They weren't entirely unsound, but they weren't entirely sound either." She resumed her needlework without further elaboration, which Clara understood as Eleanor Caldwell's version of an open hand. "Thank you," Clara said. "Don't thank me yet," Eleanor said. "The hearing's still 6 weeks away, Mom." The Granger organization's next move came not against Clara, not through social channels, but directly at the legal process, which meant it was the move Clara had calculated as most likely and had prepared for and still found alarming when it materialized. Their lawyer, a man named Garrett Cross, who worked out of Phoenix and had handled the Mercer Ranch's legal affairs for 8 years, called the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon with news that the Granger Company had filed a supplemental brief to their water rights challenge. The brief introduced a new argument, not the notarial deficiency claim they'd originally filed, but a jurisdictional question about whether the 1887 agreement had ever been properly ratified under the territorial governance structure that existed at that specific date. It was, Garrett explained with the careful phrasing of a man who was annoyed but not surprised, a technical argument that was almost certainly wrong, but almost certainly valid enough to require a legal response, which meant the hearing would need to address the jurisdictional question in addition to the original challenge, which meant their brief had to expand, which meant the 6 weeks they had were now 5 weeks because the additional preparation time ate into the margin. Clara sat at the study desk after the call and went through the implications. Then she went through them again. Then she pulled out the original 1887 territorial governance record she'd obtained from the county archive 3 weeks earlier on instinct rather than specific need, because she'd learned in 7 years of this work that primary documents almost always contain something the legal filings didn't capture, and she had developed the habit of pulling everything and reading it fully before she knew what she needed. She found the ratification record on page 14. It was a single paragraph in the minutes of the 1887 territorial governance session, recording the formal ratification of all water agreements filed under the Consolidated Land Act of that year. The minutes listed every ratified agreement by filing date and county. The Mercer Upstream Agreement was on the list, filed June 3rd and ratified June 28th. The jurisdictional argument the Granger brief was making required the agreement to not have been ratified. The ratification record was right here, in a document sitting on the study desk in Clara's handwriting. See page 14, Governance Minutes, June 1887, ratified June 28th, because she'd made notes when she first read it. She read the paragraph again. She read her notes. She sat back in the chair and felt the particular sensation of something clicking into place that doesn't quite feel like victory yet, because the hearing is still weeks away, but feels like the moment you realize the piece you need has been in your hand the whole time. She went to find Cole. He was on the back porch with a cup of coffee, looking at the January sky. She came out and handed him the governance minutes and pointed to page 14. He read it. "This kills the jurisdictional argument," he said. "It does," she said. "Completely. The agreement was ratified under the correct authority 28 days after filing. There's no jurisdictional gap. Garrett needs this. I'm sending it tomorrow morning." She sat down in the other chair. "Cole, when Granger's lawyers see this document, and they will, because Garrett will file it as supporting evidence, they're going to know that the supplemental brief doesn't work. That means the original challenge doesn't work. And if neither challenge works, they have nothing to put in front of the hearing on the water rights question." Cole looked at her. "They'll withdraw? Or they'll try a third argument, but a third argument at this point would look like what it is, harassment." She paused. "Garrett thinks the hearing judge is a man named Fowler, who's been on the territorial bench for 20 years and has a low tolerance for filings that waste the court's time. If Granger's team files a third challenge after 2 have been countered with primary documentation, Fowler is likely to take a dim view of the entire Granger position." Cole was quiet, looking at the page 14 paragraph. "She'd have liked you," he said. Clara looked at him. "Margaret." He didn't look up from the document. She had no patience for people who use small technical arguments to get around things they couldn't win honestly. She called it— He paused, something moving across his face. She called it cowardice, wearing a tie. He set the document on his knee. "She would have liked the way you work." Clara said nothing for a moment. The evening was settling around them, cold and clear, the kind of January evening that has no noise in it. "I wish I'd known her," Clara said. "You would have argued," he said. "She had opinions about how things should run." "So do I." "I know." The corner of his mouth moved. "That's why I think you would have gotten along." The week before the hearing was the hardest, not because of the legal preparation, that was going well, and Garrett Cross had driven up from Phoenix on the Tuesday and spent 2 days going through every document Clara had assembled with the methodical ferocity of a man who had been handed a genuinely strong case and intended to use every bit of it. The jurisdictional ratification record had done what Clara had predicted. The Granger brief had been quietly amended the following week. The jurisdictional argument dropped without acknowledgement, which Garrett noted with dry satisfaction was the legal equivalent of backing down while pretending you hadn't moved. The hard part was the human part, which was always, in Clara's experience, the part that couldn't be fully managed. George Polk called the ranch on a Thursday evening and said he needed to talk. Cole rode over the next morning and came back 4 hours later looking tired. Polk had received a visit from a man who'd offered to buy his eastern grazing leases at a price that was, Polk had to admit, fair. Not predatory. Fair. The kind of offer that was hard to turn down without a clear and immediate reason that outweighed the money. What did he say? Clara asked. He said he needed to know if what we're bringing to the hearing is going to hold, Cole said. He said he's been watching, and he believes us, but he needs to know whether the legal argument is solid enough to risk turning down a fair offer. What did you tell him? I told him the truth. That we have strong documentation, a good lawyer, a judge who doesn't like procedural harassment, and 7 ranch families standing together. He paused. And I told him I couldn't guarantee the outcome because I've never been able to guarantee an outcome in my life. And any man who told him different was selling something. And he said that was the most honest thing anyone had said to him in 6 months. Cole sat down at the kitchen table. He'll be there. Clara let out a breath. But Granger wasn't finished. On the Saturday before the hearing, 2 things happened in sequence that Clara had not fully anticipated in combination. The first was a story in the Sulphur Creek Gazette, a small paper, locally owned, that ran more or less accurately most of the time. The story described the upcoming hearing and characterized it as a dispute between the Mercer Ranch and the Granger Land Company over water rights documentation. It was technically accurate. It framed the situation as a business disagreement between 2 parties. It did not mention the 7 independent ranch families. It did not mention the subsidiary pattern. And it included, near the end, a statement attributed to a spokesperson for the Granger Land Company, describing their position as a legitimate clarification of existing documentation that had been unnecessarily complicated by outside interference. Outside interference. Clara read the phrase twice. It was aimed at her, and it was aimed precisely. Not at Cole, not at the ranch, but at the concept of outside interference, which connected neatly to every piece of gossip that had circulated since September about an unknown woman from Tucson inserting herself into the Mercer operation. The second thing was that Silas Granger himself came to the Mercer Ranch. He arrived on a Saturday afternoon in a well-maintained carriage with a driver and without prior notice, which was itself a statement. A man arriving without notice was either being rude or demonstrating that he didn't believe an appointment was required. Clara was in the study when she heard the carriage in the yard. She looked out the window and saw the Granger Company name on the carriage door. She went to find Cole, who was already coming in from the barn. Silas Granger was in his late 50s, a tall man who had used physical presence effectively his entire life. He was well-dressed, without ostentation. A man who understood that the best money looked like it didn't need to announce itself. He shook Cole's hand on the porch steps with the practiced ease of someone who had made a career of making powerful gestures look routine. Cole, he said, I thought it was past time we spoke directly. Cole looked at him. Should have thought that 6 months ago, Silas. Granger's smile adjusted slightly. He looked at Clara, who was standing just behind Cole's shoulder. Miss Ashford, I've heard a great deal about your work here. I expect you have, she said. Shall we go inside? Granger said to Cole rather than to her. We're fine here, Cole said. Granger paused. Then he nodded once and turned so that he was addressing both of them. I want to be direct. I have a great deal of respect for this operation, always have. What I've done regarding certain filings was aggressive, I'll acknowledge that. But we're looking at a territorial water situation that's going to create serious problems for every property in this valley when the dry years come again, and I believe coordination is the answer rather than competition. He paused. I'm prepared to offer a joint water management arrangement, a fair agreement structured equitably that protects the Mercer upstream rights and gives the Granger properties shared access during shortage periods. It would make the hearing unnecessary. Silence on the porch. Somewhere in the yard, a horse moved in a stall. Cole looked at Granger for a moment. Clara watched Cole's profile, the jaw set, the eyes quiet and deliberate. You filed a legal challenge against a correctly registered document, Cole said. You had my water rights re-registered with a clause removed. You bought a piece of my debt and sent an assessor to my property with an authorization document that didn't cover what he was claiming it covered. He paused. You tried to have my estate manager removed through a complaint to her agency, and last week you put a story in the Gazette about outside interference. He held Granger's gaze. And now you'd like a fair agreement. Granger was quiet. The hearing's in 6 days, Cole said. We'll see you there. Granger looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Clara, not with hostility, but with the particular look of a man reassessing a calculation. You built this, he said to her. The coalition, the documentation. The ranchers in this valley made their own decisions, she said. I just made sure they had accurate information. Granger turned his hat in his hands once. The first thing she'd seen him do that looked like anything other than complete control. Then he put it back on his head and turned to his carriage. At the carriage step he stopped. He didn't turn around. You're going to win the water rights question, he said. The jurisdictional argument was always thin, I know that. A pause. The other filings are more complicated. You should know that going in. He got into the carriage. The driver turned them around and they went back through the gate. Cole and Clara stood on the porch. He just told us something, Clara said quietly. That the other filings are more complicated, Cole said. The debt instrument, the duplicate filing. He thinks he still has legal standing on those even if the water rights challenge fails. He might be right. She looked at where the carriage had disappeared onto the road. Or he might be trying to shake our confidence 6 days before the hearing. Which is it? She thought about Silas Granger, the carriage with his name on the door, the practiced handshake, the moment when he'd turned his hat, just once. Both probably, she said. He's not wrong that those instruments are more complicated, but he's also trying to make us feel like we're going to walk into the hearing with something less than we have. Cole looked at her. Do we have enough? She thought about Henry Alderman deciding to stand up anyway, about George Polk saying the most honest thing anyone had told him was that the outcome couldn't be guaranteed, about the ratification record on page 14 of the governance minutes, sitting in a leather case in the study, about Dan riding out in January cold to talk to ranching families he'd known for years and coming back with commitments, one by one, about the moment she'd stood at a gate in September with 2 leather bags and a man telling her to leave. Yes, she said. We have enough. She went inside to review the legal brief one last time. Cole stood on the porch for another minute, and then he followed her in, and the door closed behind them on the January evening, and 6 days ahead of them was the hearing that would determine what this valley was. February 14th arrived on a Tuesday, cold and bright, the kind of morning that had no mercy in it and no softness either, just clear air and hard light, and the thing in front of you exactly as it was. The Sulphur Creek Courthouse held more people than Clara had expected. She and Cole arrived with Garrett Cross at 8:30 for a 9 o'clock start, and the public gallery was already 3/4 full. She recognized faces from the ranching families, faces from town, Eleanor Caldwell in the 4th row with Frances Blythe beside her, and an expression that said she had positioned herself deliberately and knew it. Silas Granger arrived at 8:50 with 2 lawyers, which was 2 more than he'd had at the initial filing stage. Clara noted this and said nothing. Judge Fowler was everything Garrett had described. A thin man in his 60s with the air of someone who had watched a great deal of human foolishness from this bench and maintained his patience for it through sheer discipline. He called the hearing to order at 9 exactly and looked at the gallery once with an expression that suggested he noted its size and had already formed a view about what it meant. Garrett presented their case in the order Clara had structured. The original 1887 agreement, the ratification record, the improper re-registration by the Granger subsidiary, the corrected filing. He introduced the duplicate filing with the drought clause as evidence of a pattern of conduct. He presented the subsidiary mapping, all 7 properties, 4 years, the full chain of connected filings, clearly and without drama, letting the documents speak. When he introduced the subsidiary mapping, something happened in the gallery. It was not loud. People in courthouses learned to be quiet, but it was palpable. The independent ranchers who had come, and their families, and the neighbors who'd heard about the hearing, all of them sitting in the gallery looking at a map that showed what had been done quietly and individually to each of them was also being done to all of them, and it had a name, and it was documented. Clara watched Silas Granger's lead lawyer during the subsidiary mapping presentation. The man's face gave nothing away, which was professional, but his pen stopped moving for about 30 seconds, which was not nothing. Granger's legal team presented their counter-argument over the following 90 minutes. It was thorough and professionally executed, and it was not as strong as it had been 6 weeks ago, before the jurisdictional argument had been gutted by page 14. They focused on the debt instrument and the duplicate filing, arguing that each represented a legitimate commercial and administrative action under existing territorial law. Judge Fowler asked 7 questions. 2 of them were directed at Granger's lawyers, and both were the kind that require a direct answer rather than elaboration. 3 were directed at Garrett, and Garrett answered each with a document. The final 2 were directed at the gallery, which was unusual. Judges didn't generally address the gallery, but Fowler looked out over the assembled ranchers and asked whether anyone present wished to make a formal statement regarding the pattern of filings described in the evidence. Henry Alderman stood up first. He said, in about 4 sentences, that he had a note held by a Granger subsidiary, that he had not fully understood its terms when he signed it, and that the drought clause in that note matched the language in the duplicate Mercer filing that Garrett had introduced into evidence. He sat back down. His voice had been steady. George Polk stood up next and said that a Granger subsidiary had filed a documentation request against his grazing leases 8 months ago, using language he could now recognize from the evidence as identical to the language used against 2 of the other properties on the map. Maria Reyes stood up and said her late husband had received a visit from a land assessor in 1892 and had signed a document he didn't fully understand, and the document was still in her files at home, and she'd like to submit it to the court if that was permissible. It was permissible. Miguel Castillo did not stand up. He handed a written statement to Garrett, who read it into the record. 3 paragraphs describing an attempt by a Granger subsidiary representative to purchase the Castillo water rights separately from the land in a transaction structured in a way that would have left the Castillo operation without secure water access within 5 years. 4 more families, 4 more pieces of the same pattern, coming from different directions, meeting at the same point. Fowler listened to all of it without expression. When the gallery finished, he recessed for 40 minutes. Clara sat in the hard courthouse chair and looked at her hands and did not talk to anyone. Cole sat beside her and also didn't talk. Garrett reviewed his notes. The gallery murmured behind them. When Fowler came back, he took his seat and looked at the 2 legal teams in the gallery and the documents piled on the evidence table. And he said, in the measured voice of a man who had made a decision and was being precise about it, the water rights challenge was dismissed. The original 1887 agreement was confirmed as correctly ratified, and the corrected filing stood. On the duplicate filing, Fowler found insufficient evidence that it had been executed in good faith and ordered it struck from the county record. On the debt instruments, Alderman's note and the Mercer instrument both, he referred the matter to the Territorial Attorney General's office for review of whether the acquisition and structuring of those instruments constituted an improper pattern of commercial conduct under existing territorial statutes, and he stayed enforcement of both instruments pending that review. He did not find Granger liable for anything. He didn't say the word fraud. He was a judge, and he was careful. But he referred the subsidiary mapping to the Attorney General, and he struck the duplicate filing, and he confirmed the water rights, and he stayed the debt instruments. In the gallery, someone exhaled audibly. Clara thought it might have been Eleanor Caldwell, but she wasn't certain. Silas Granger left the courthouse without speaking to anyone. His lawyers gathered their papers with the practiced efficiency of people who knew how to exit a room after a bad day. Clara watched him go, tall, controlled, the same posture he'd had when he stepped out of his carriage at the Mercer Ranch gate. He did not look at her. Outside on the courthouse steps, the February light was flat and cold and honest. The ranchers from the gallery were coming out in 1s and 2s. Henry Alderman shook Cole's hand and then, unexpectedly, Clara's. George Polk said, "Well," in the tone of a man for whom that word covered everything. Maria Reyes hugged Clara briefly and unexpectedly, and Clara stood in the hug for a moment before she remembered what to do with her arms. Dan Purcell was standing at the bottom of the steps. He'd been in the gallery, 4th row from the back. He looked at Clara as she came down. "Not bad," he said. She looked at him. "Not bad?" For a woman who wasn't supposed to be here, he said. And then, in the way of a man who meant it without knowing quite how to say it, I'm glad you stayed. Cole was behind her. She heard him say something to Garrett about the Attorney General referral. She stood at the bottom of the courthouse steps in the February cold and looked at the town she'd arrived in as a stranger 5 months ago, with 2 leather bags and a cardboard box and a man telling her to leave, and felt the particular feeling of something that isn't quite winning and isn't quite relief, but is something more durable than either. The valley was not fixed. The Attorney General review would take months. Granger still held financial instruments and political connections and patience. Nothing was fully resolved the way endings in stories get to be resolved. But the pattern had been named in a public room. The documents were in the court record. The ranchers had stood up. That was enough for today. It would have to be. The Attorney General's review took 4 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days. Clara knew the exact count because she'd been keeping track the way she kept track of everything. Not obsessively, not with anxiety, but with the patient discipline of someone who understands that time is a resource and wasting it on uncertainty accomplishes nothing. She had a calendar on the study wall with the review start date marked, and every morning when she came downstairs she registered the passage of another day, the same way she registered the weather or the supply numbers, as information, neutral, useful. What wasn't neutral was the waiting itself. That part was harder than she let anyone see. The months after the hearing had a strange doubled quality to them. On the surface, the ranch ran better than it had run in years. The East pasture cattle hit weight projections for the first time in 3 seasons. The corrected water rights documentation was clean in the county record. The supply system held. The accounts were balanced and current. Dan Purcell, who had started the year as a man tolerating Clara's presence with barely concealed suspicion, now brought her the morning figures before Cole was out of bed and asked her opinion on operational decisions with the matter-of-fact ease of someone who had decided to stop pretending that wasn't what he was doing. Underneath all of that ran the Attorney General review, slow and invisible, the way a deep current runs under a river that looks calm from the bank. Silas Granger had not disappeared. He was still in the territory, still operating his 2 ranches, still holding the financial instruments that the court had stayed but not voided. The stay meant he couldn't enforce them, couldn't call Alderman's note, couldn't press the Mercer debt claim. But staying something is not the same as resolving it. It's more like pressing pause on a record that starts again when you lift your finger. Clara had explained this carefully to Cole in February, and again in March when he'd asked about the timeline, and once more in April when the waiting had started to wear on him in ways he didn't say directly, but that she could read in the set of his shoulders, and the way he sometimes stood at the study window in the evenings, looking at nothing in particular. The review is moving, she told him in April. Garrett says the Attorney General's office has been requesting additional county records. That's a sign of substantive investigation, not just paperwork processing. Garrett says a lot of things, Cole said. He wasn't being unfair to Garrett. He was being honest about the limits of patience. He does, she agreed. Most of them turn out to be accurate. Cole looked at the window. The April evening was doing what April evenings in Arizona do, turning the mountains purple and the sky colors that have no names in any language she knew. What happens if the review comes back inconclusive? Then we have the water rights secured and the instruments stayed indefinitely while legal challenges continue. She paused. It's not the clean resolution we want, but Granger doesn't get to use what he built either. He spent years and significant money on a campaign that's currently producing nothing for him. That's not justice, Cole said. No, she said, it's not. But it's often what you get, and getting it is better than not getting it. He turned from the window. When did you make peace with that? She thought about it honestly. Somewhere in New Mexico, she said. When the family I was working for lost a third of what they should have recovered from the man who'd been stealing from them, because the legal costs of pursuing the full amount would have cost more than they'd get back. She paused. I was angry about it for about a week, and then I thought, they kept the ranch, the stealing stopped, the man responsible knew that people knew what he'd done, and the family could move forward. She looked at Cole. Not perfect, but functional. I decided functional was worth working for even when perfect wasn't available. Cole held her gaze for a moment. You're talking about more than Granger, he said. She didn't answer immediately. Then she said, I'm talking about how things work, generally. He let it go. She wasn't sure if she was grateful for that or not. The Attorney General's finding arrived on a Tuesday in late June, a formal document delivered to Garrett Cross in Phoenix, who telephoned the ranch and read the key sections to Cole while Clara stood nearby and listened to Cole's side of the conversation, filling in Garrett's words from the responses. When Cole hung up, he stood at the study desk and was quiet for a moment. "Tell me," Clara said. "The Mercer debt instrument was found to have been acquired as part of a pattern of coordinated commercial interference," Cole said. "The finding uses the phrase predatory acquisition designed to establish coercive leverage. Garrett said those are unusually strong words for a territorial review." He looked at the desk. "The instrument is voided. Not stayed, voided. The alderman note is voided on the same grounds. The Granger Land Company is prohibited from filing further claims against any of the 7 properties named in the county hearing record for a period of 10 years. Clara sat down in the chair. "There's more," Cole said. The duplicate filing, the one with the drought clause, the Attorney General's review found it was filed with falsified supporting documentation. The notary whose name appears on the filing didn't sign it. They're referring that specific matter to the territorial court for fraud prosecution. He paused. Garrett says the fraud charge changes things significantly. It's criminal rather than civil. It names the Granger Land Company directly. The room was quiet. "That's more than I expected," Clara said finally. "Yes." "I didn't think the fraud piece would come out of the review. I thought that would require separate investigation." Apparently, the Attorney General's office found the falsification when they were pulling the original notary records. Cole sat down across from her. "Someone in Granger's operation was careless or got scared and made a mistake." She thought about that. About the machine Silas Granger had built over 4 years. Careful, patient, technically meticulous. And the single point where the care had failed. A forged signature on a notary record. The kind of thing that happens when an organization has been cutting corners long enough that cutting corners becomes habit, or when the people executing the plan are not as committed to precision as the man who designed it. "He's going to fight the fraud charge," she said. "Probably. He has money and lawyers, and he'll stretch the prosecution out as long as he can." "Probably," Cole said again. "But the instruments are voided today," she said, "and the 10-year prohibition is in effect today. And the water rights are clean." She looked at the desk, at the leather case that had held the original 1887 agreement, at the stacks of documents that represented 9 months of work. He built a machine to take apart this valley piece by piece, and today it stopped. Cole looked at her. There was something in his face that she'd been watching develop over months. Not the grief stillness she'd found when she arrived, not the cautious assessment of the first weeks, but something quieter and more settled. The look of a man who had come back to himself after being away somewhere. "Clara," he said. "Yes." "Your 3 months ended in December." She looked at him. "I know that." "It's June." "I'm aware. You've been here 9 months." "Cole?" She kept her voice level. "If you're building toward something, build toward it. I'm not good at circling." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I don't want you to leave." She held his gaze. "I wasn't planning to. I'm not asking you to stay as an estate manager. I know what you're not asking." "Then what are you saying?" She looked at him for a moment. This man she'd met at a gate in September, who told her to leave and then sat down at his own kitchen table and eaten supper for the first time in months, who had shown up at every hard conversation and never once asked her to be smaller than she was, who had stood on courthouse steps in February cold and said, "We'll see you there," to a man with 2 lawyers and a carriage with his name on the door. "I'm saying I know," she said, "and I'm not leaving." It wasn't a romantic declaration. It wasn't tearful or dramatic. It was 2 people who had been honest with each other for 9 months, arriving at a truth they'd both been walking toward for a while, and acknowledging it in the same way they acknowledged everything, directly, without excess, with a full understanding of what it meant. Cole reached across the desk and put his hand over hers. Just that. She looked at his hand on hers, and she didn't move away. Cosette. The news about the Attorney General's finding reached Sulphur Creek the way news always reached Sulphur Creek. Through Rita Voss's dry goods store, through the Stockman's Club, through Eleanor Caldwell's network, which Clara had come to understand was the most efficient information distribution system in the territory and operated entirely on social currency rather than telegraphs. By Thursday, Eleanor had called on Clara personally, not with Frances Blythe this time, just Eleanor herself, who arrived in the afternoon and sat at the kitchen table without ceremony and said, "The Granger fraud referral is the talk of the county." "I imagine it is," Clara said. "People are saying the Mercer Ranch found it." Eleanor held her coffee cup in both hands. "That's not entirely accurate, from what I understand. The Attorney General's office found it during their review," Clara said. "We provided the review with the documentation that prompted the investigation." "Yes," Eleanor said. "That's what I mean." She looked at Clara over the rim of her cup. "You know what people are also saying?" "Probably several things. They're saying Cole Mercer has someone good working beside him." Eleanor set down the cup. "Not for him. Beside him." She paused. "That's a distinction people in this valley have noticed." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Is it a problem?" "6 months ago it might have been," Eleanor said. "Now, no. People don't argue with results, Miss Ashford. They might tell stories about them, but they don't argue with them." She paused. "And people in this county have been living under a slowly tightening pressure for 4 years without being able to name it. Now it's named and stopped. That changes how they think about who did the naming." "The ranchers did the naming," Clara said. "In the courtroom." "They did," Eleanor agreed, "because someone gave them the information they needed to understand what they were seeing." She looked at Clara directly, with the frank assessment she'd brought to every conversation they'd had. "I was wrong about you when you arrived. I want to say that plainly." "You were cautious," Clara said. "That's different from wrong." "I was both," Eleanor said. "The caution was reasonable. The conclusions I was drawing from it were not." She picked up her cup again. "I wanted to say it to you directly, without Cole in the room. Because the caution and the wrong conclusions were aimed at you specifically, and the apology should be too." Clara looked at this woman she'd spent months reading as an obstacle and felt something shift in that assessment. Not entirely, because Eleanor Caldwell was still a woman who policed the boundaries of what was acceptable in ways that Clara found limiting, but shifted enough to see the person inside the role. Someone who was trying, in her own constrained way, to be fair. "Thank you," Clara said. "Genuinely." Eleanor nodded once. "What happens to Granger now?" "The fraud prosecution will take time. His lawyers will challenge everything. But the instruments are voided regardless of what happens criminally, and the prohibition stands." Clara paused. "He still has his 2 ranches. He still has money and connections. He loses his campaign in this valley, but he doesn't lose everything." "Is that enough?" "It's what the law can do," Clara said. "What the law can do and what justice looks like aren't always identical. I've had to make peace with that." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Margaret used to say something like that," she said. "She used to say that waiting for perfect justice meant waiting forever, and meanwhile the ranch needs tending." She looked at her cup. She was a practical woman. "She sounds like someone worth knowing," Clara said. She was. Eleanor stood up. "She would have approved of you. I want you to know that, specifically." Clara looked up at her. "She would have approved," Eleanor repeated. "And she was a harder judge of people than I am." She picked up her hat. "I'll see myself out." "You can." Henry Alderman came by the ranch on a Saturday in July with a bottle of good whiskey and the specific look of a man who has had a document voided that he'd been carrying like a stone around his neck for 2 years. Cole met him on the porch, and they stood there with the July heat rising off the yard and the bottle between them on the railing, not opening it yet, just talking. Clara heard pieces of the conversation from the study window. Not intentionally, but the windows were open because of the heat, and voices carry in still air. She heard Henry say something about the North expansion, and Cole say something about the review, and then a long silence, and then Henry's voice saying, "I almost went to Granger's side before you came to me. I was close." And Cole's voice, "I know. I wouldn't have felt good about it." "I know that too." Another silence. Then Henry, "She's something, your Clara." Clara stopped pretending she wasn't listening. Cole's voice, after a moment, "Yes, she is." She went back to her work, but she sat with those words for a while. The simple, unadorned way Cole had said "yes, she is," without qualification or clarification, the way you speak when something is settled, rather than still being examined. Your Clara. She'd never belonged to anywhere. That was the truth of her life before September. 7 years of arrivals and departures, of operations restored and arrangements concluded, of knowing exactly when she was expected to leave because that was what the work required. She'd built a professional life out of not staying, out of the particular freedom and particular loneliness of always being the person who fixed things and moved on. She sat at the desk in Cole Mercer's study, in the house that had gone from a cave to a home over 9 months, and understood that she had stopped being the person who was going to move on. She wasn't entirely sure when it had happened. Probably not a single moment. More likely accumulated, the way the ranch's recovery had accumulated, in increments, in small decisions that each seemed individually manageable and only looked like a pattern when you stepped back far enough to see the shape of them. Dan Purcell resigned as foreman in August, not from any dissatisfaction. He was very clear about that, telling both Cole and Clara in the same conversation, so neither of them would have to speculate. His wife's sister in California was ill and needed help, and Dan's wife had been wanting to go for 6 months, and he'd been holding off because he didn't know how to leave the ranch without feeling like he was abandoning it. "I know it's stable now," he said. They were in the barn, the three of them, which was where Dan seemed to prefer serious conversations. "I wouldn't go if it weren't." "You've been waiting to make sure we were all right before you left," Cole said. Dan looked at the floor. 12 years, he said. "You don't just walk away from 12 years. Dan," Cole put his hand on the man's shoulder. "Go. Your family needs you." Dan looked at Clara. "You'll manage." "We'll manage," she said. He left at the end of August, on a morning that was already cool with the first edge of fall. He shook Cole's hand for a long time. He shook Clara's hand and then, unexpectedly, hugged her. Brief and awkward and genuine, the hug of a man who had decided he respected someone more than he was comfortable expressing and was trying to express it anyway. His replacement was a young man named Hector Vargas, who was 28 and had worked the Castillo Ranch for 5 years, and came with Miguel Castillo's personal recommendation. Clara interviewed him herself, which would have been unthinkable in September and was unremarkable in August. Hector was quiet and observant and competent, and in his second week on the ranch, he fixed a problem with the north fence line that had been causing slow losses for 2 seasons, which was the kind of initiative that mattered more than any interview answer. "He's good," Clara told Cole. "Better than you expected?" "About what I expected," she said. "Miguel doesn't recommend people lightly." They were on the back porch. It was a September evening, which meant it had been 1 year. The anniversary hadn't been discussed, and she wasn't going to bring it up, but she was aware of it in the way you're aware of things that matter, at the edge of whatever else you're thinking about. Cole said, "Do you remember what you told me when I asked why you came here? That the letter used the word partner and it told you the position was unusual?" "Yes. I've been thinking about that word for a while." She looked at him. "I used it because I didn't know what else to use," he said. "At midnight, by myself in this study, trying to write a letter I wasn't sure I needed to write. I didn't mean it as a legal category. I didn't mean it as a job description." He paused. "I think I meant it the way I'd use it if I were being honest about what was missing." "And what was missing?" He looked at the west pasture, the same view they'd looked at a year ago, the first evening she'd sat on this porch, the light going out of the sky, the mountains going dark at the edges, the particular stillness of land that belongs to itself. "Someone to make decisions with," he said. "Someone to argue with and be wrong in front of. Someone who knows what the operation actually is because they've been inside it, not because I've explained it to them." He paused. "Someone to sit here at the end of the day." Clara sat with that. "You wrote a letter at midnight and you put all of that in one word." "Apparently." She looked at the pasture. "Cole, I need to tell you something." He waited. "When I arrived, I thought this was going to be a 6-month placement, a troubled operation, legitimate work, a clean conclusion." She turned her cup in her hands. A habit she'd picked up from him, she'd noticed, somewhere in the months of sharing a kitchen. "I thought I'd fix what was fixable and recommend what wasn't, and move on the way I always had." "What changed?" "Everything," she said. Then more precisely, "You changed. The ranch changed. I changed, probably, though I'm less certain about what that means exactly." She looked at him directly. "I've been good at leaving. I built a professional life out of it. I told myself it was discipline. I think it was partly fear." "Fear of what?" "Of being somewhere that could stop being mine." She said it plainly, because she'd learned that plainness was the only register Cole really trusted. Every placement I left, it wasn't mine to keep. That was the arrangement. Built in from the start. She paused. This is different, and I've known it was different for months, and I haven't known what to do with that. Cole set down his cup. He turned to look at her. Not the side glance, not the checking the horizon look, but directly, the way he'd looked at her on the courthouse steps and in the study when the Attorney General results came, and in the kitchen 100 mornings that had accumulated into something that couldn't be counted or measured the way she measured other things. It's yours, he said. Whatever you want it to be. The ranch, the work, this porch. He paused. Me, if you want that. She looked at him for a long moment. There was nothing dramatic in the air between them. No revelation, no sudden certainty. Just two people who had been moving toward the same place for a year and had finally arrived at it, and the arrival felt less like a moment than like the natural end of a long road. Expected, earned, a little strange in the way that things you've been working toward always feel a little strange when you actually reach them. I want that, she said. He reached over and took her hand, the same way he had in the study in June, unhurried, without performance. She let him. They sat on the back porch as the stars came out over the west pasture, and neither of them talked for a while, and the silence was the good kind. Punked it. The Granger fraud prosecution moved through the territorial courts over the following year with the grinding slowness of formal legal processes. Silas Granger's lawyers challenged every element and filed continuances at every opportunity, which stretched what might have been a 6-month proceeding into 14 months. During that time, Granger continued to operate his 2 ranches, continued to attend the Stockman's Club, continued to exist in the valley as a presence that had been diminished but not eliminated. Clara followed the prosecution through Garrett Cross, who sent monthly updates. She read them and filed them, and did not let them consume more attention than they warranted. The fraud charge was real, and the evidence was documented, and the outcome was going to be what it was going to be. Spending energy anticipating it was energy taken from the work in front of her, which was considerable. In March of the following year, Silas Granger accepted a plea agreement. He admitted to filing a document with a falsified notary signature, paid a substantial fine, and was prohibited from conducting land transactions in the Arizona Territory for 15 years. He did not go to prison, which meant the outcome was imperfect. He also did not walk away from it intact, which meant it was real. Clara read Garrett's account of the plea agreement on a Tuesday morning at the kitchen table. She read it, put it down, and went out to the east pasture to check on a fence repair that Hector had flagged the day before. The east pasture cattle were fat and healthy. The fence repair was solid. The irrigation line that she'd redesigned in her second week on the ranch was running clean. She stood in the east pasture in the March morning and felt something she didn't have an exact word for. Not triumph, which implied the other side had been defeated in a way that felt more complete than this. Not relief exactly. More like the specific satisfaction of a thing that has been out of order being returned to order. Imperfectly, incompletely, with considerable effort and significant cost to several people who didn't deserve the cost, but returned. She walked back to the house. What she has learned in the years that followed is this. The story she could have told about the Mercer Ranch would have been about money, about the numbers recovered, the waste eliminated, the irrigation fixed, the books balanced. $9,000 in the first 2 months, substantially more over the year. A cattle operation restored to its potential and then pushed past it by the addition of attention and systems and people who were doing their jobs honestly. That story was true, but it was the smaller truth. The larger truth is about what happens when a person stops paying attention to their life, not their work, their life, and what accumulates in the space that opens up. Cole Mercer hadn't lost his operation through negligence exactly. He'd lost it through grief that had no outlet, through 3 years of being present enough to keep the machine running and absent enough to miss the cracks spreading underneath. The money was fine. The man was going hollow. She'd seen this before. In New Mexico, in Colorado, in 3 other operations she'd managed where the numbers were only the symptom and the actual problem was a person who had been diminished by something and was too busy surviving to notice. She'd fixed the numbers in those cases and moved on, because that's what the arrangement was. Fix the numbers, submit the report, leave. She used to think that was discipline. She understands now that it was also a way of not having to feel the limits of what she could do. It's easier to leave before you find out whether the person would have recovered if you'd stayed. Easier to keep moving than to find out whether the place you're in could actually become yours. The thing about being good at leaving is that it protects you from finding out what staying costs, but it also protects you from finding out what staying gives you, and that's the part she hadn't fully accounted for. Cole Mercer came back to himself. That's the part of the story that matters most and is the hardest to document because it doesn't show up in ledgers or county filings or legal briefs. It shows up in a man cooking supper in his own kitchen, in a foreman who says we instead of the boss, in a house that started breathing again after 3 years of holding its breath, in a back porch that became, gradually, the place where two people ended their days. She is not a perfect person in a perfect situation. She knows this. She has a temper that runs cold rather than hot, which means people sometimes don't realize she's angry until she's been angry for a week. She has habits of self-sufficiency that are sometimes close enough to stubbornness to be indistinguishable. She finds it easier to read a financial instrument than to say plainly what she's feeling, and she has to remind herself that Cole cannot read her financial documents with the ease she reads them, which means she has to occasionally use words instead of figures. Cole is not a perfect person either. He is still, sometimes, a man who goes quiet in ways that are hard to interpret and needs to be asked directly what he's thinking rather than wait it out. He has pride that occasionally mistakes itself for principle. He took 3 years to start paying attention again after Margaret died, which was both understandable and costly, and he'll probably always carry some version of that, the knowledge that grief made him absent at a time when presence was required. They argue. Not often, but with enough substance when they do that the resolutions feel earned rather than performed. The ranch does not run perfectly. No operation does. There are bad seasons and personnel problems and supply issues in one particularly expensive spring when a late frost damaged the west pasture grays, and they spent 6 weeks managing an unexpected loss with the particular grim focus of people who have been through worse and know how to get through this too. What doesn't happen is quiet collapse. The small failures don't multiply anymore because someone is watching. The Mercer Ranch became, over the following years, the anchor of something that hadn't quite existed in the Sulphur Creek Valley before. Not a formal organization, nothing with a name and bylaws, but a network of independent ranchers who had learned through a particular winter of hard circumstances that isolation was a liability rather than a virtue. They met informally, traded information about water conditions and cattle prices and county records, and operated with this kind of low-key mutual awareness that meant none of them were as vulnerable as they'd been when Silas Granger was working through them one by one. Henry Alderman paid off his North Expansion loan through conventional financing the year after his Granger note was voided. He sent Clara a letter that was mostly about cattle prices, and was also, in its last paragraph, about gratitude. The specific kind that a man who doesn't write letters easily puts into one when he decides it needs to be said. George Polk remained prickly and occasionally difficult and was there every time it mattered. Maria Reyes expanded the Reyes operation by 40 acres in the spring of the second year, the first expansion the family had attempted since her husband died. She came to tell Clara personally, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee, and said only, "I didn't think we could anymore." And then I did. Clara thought about that for a long time, about the particular way fear masquerades as realism. The way the story we tell about our limitations becomes the limitation itself, until something breaks the story open and you discover the constraint was always partly narrative. She had told herself for 7 years that she was someone who left, that this was her nature, her skill, the shape of her professional life. And it was true for a long time, but it was also a story. And stories can change when the circumstances that made them necessary change. The greatest things she'd built in her professional life, the accounts, the irrigation design, the water rights documentation, the county filing analysis, were things she built with her intelligence and her discipline and the careful skills of 7 years of hard work. The greatest thing she'd built in her personal life was harder to name. It was made of decisions rather than documents. The decision to walk through a gate when a man told her to leave. The decision to sit at a kitchen table instead of the cookhouse. The decision to stay through September and October and November, until the stain became something it couldn't be undone from. It was made of a man who wrote the word partner at midnight and meant it before he knew he meant it, of a foreman who learned to say we, of a valley that found out it could hold together when something tried to pull it apart. The wealthy rancher who had believed, somewhere in the long grief of 3 years, that money could insulate a person from the need for other people, who had run his operation like a machine because machines are easier to manage than the truth of being alone, found that he'd been wrong about that. Not about the money, about the insulation. The woman who had made leaving a skill discovered that what she'd actually been good at all along was not leaving. It was arriving. It was walking into a place and seeing it clearly and understanding what it needed. What this place needed was someone to stay. She did. And the ranch and the valley and the life she built there, imperfect, complicated, earned through work that doesn't show up in any ledger, was the answer to a question she hadn't known she was asking when she arrived at a gate in September with 2 leather bags and a cardboard box tied with twine. The question was, where do you belong? The answer took 9 months to build and a lifetime to keep, but it was hers.